Sorry. That was supposed to be the gun barrel opening. I hope you guys are all doing well today. And welcome to Cinematic Realms. I'm your host, Gwyn, and with me, as always, is Jared. I always ask how's it going, Jared? But you already told me off camera that it's been a bit of a week.
It's not anything necessarily bad, just busy. Specifically, we had computer issues at work, and it meant that we had to do everything the analog way. And when you've done it a certain way for a long time, you realize just how much easier the computers make your life. So I was very happy to have them back online. I just had some work to catch up on this weekend, but when I was getting frustrated with all that, I was able to kind of escape off into the cinematic world a few times to kind of reset my emotions. And on Friday night, I got to do it with this movie, which is always just a wonderful experience.
Yeah. First of all, hello, Mother Royan. Great to see you. Thanks for joining us. It's become something that I've done more and more because, there's stuff happening in the world. So I've been choosing to really immerse myself into just the worlds that make me happy and sometimes stress me out, because it's good to focus your stress somewhere fictional.
And sometimes, as we've talked about, even if the movie itself puts you through the emotional ringer, in a weird way, that can actually help settle you down, because it kind of calibrates your emotions to what's happening on screen rather than what's happening in the real life. So, and this movie definitely puts me through the emotional ringer a lot of times in a really good way. But then it breaks your heart a little bit at the end, but ultimately everything will be okay, because that's kind of the James Bond ethos.
Yeah. Well, and that's the good thing, because this is kind of a stray thought, but that's part of the great thing about movies and sort of television, any kind of on-screen media, is that it can put us through the emotional ringer. We can lose characters that we care about, but then we can always go back to the beginning, and and those characters are there for us. So that we can be put through the emotional ringer all over again. It's part of what I kind of. Sorry, this is going to go really off topic for a second, but it was part of the joy for me I remember when Game of Thrones season 1 came out on Blu-ray, and it was adorned with all this lovely, cover art of Sean Bean as Ned Stark. And it's like, because I had absorbed the book series like all in one go, it was nice to kind of absorb season 1 of the television show as its own television season, sort of just immersed in those 10 episodes for a good year, and to have like a box set that represented, oh yeah, okay, of course we lost Ned, but there was a whole television season of Sean Bean, like, just acting the hell out of that character on screen, and I can always go back and enjoy those episodes with him in it. And I feel like that's one of the beautiful things about movies and television overall, is that we can always go back to it and revisit stories and characters that we love, even as they've sort of passed on or even passed us by.
No, it always just depends on what you're in the mood for. Like, sometimes if you're like, I just need the pick-me-up, I need a happily ever after, then that's when I go back and watch Cinderella, which we talked about last week, which I did revisit again this week. And sometimes if you want to, be put through something a little bit more stressful, you can, there are some good horror movies and some good, thrillers and psychological dramas that we talked about, like Nosferatu or Ex Machina. And sometimes, if you want a little bit of both. You want a movie that will put you through the emotional ringer, but ultimately still like lift you up with some stylish action sequences and great quips and great romance. Then you can go to the James Bond series, which we have done before with another Sean Bean vehicle, Goldeneye, in the past. But today, I think we may be talking about what I personally feel is the best of them.
And real quick before we move on, you mentioned Cinderella. I do want to do a little show and tell because I did get the soundtrack the other day, which I got off of eBay. It's in beautiful condition, and I just want to bask in the glory that was. Like, this was only 10 years ago that this was released, and this was when studios were still in the habit of releasing soundtracks on CD. And now it's, they feel, I mentioned in the Slack, it's like they're an endangered species. But I very much enjoyed listening to that. And yeah, so if any of you missed out on our discussion last week about Cinderella, check that out because we had a great time talking about that. And among many other things, we did talk about the music as well.
Well, as we always do. And yes, I do want to personally say thank you to everyone who checked out that Cinderella stream because it's, as I said, it's a movie that means a lot to me. Hey, Laura. And I've actually been very pleased to see how well it's been doing relatively in the context of our small channel. So I hope
I've been like really impressed at the numbers of our last couple of streams. We've actually been doing good. So not to bury the lead, let's get into what we're talking about here. We're talking about the 2006 007 film Casino Royale, starring one Daniel Craig in his very first appearance as James Bond. And there's going to be some stuff to talk about that I wouldn't have been on my radar a couple of weeks ago. Because Daniel Craig kind of marks the end of an era in the James Bond franchise. And, I could not have foreseen that when, all the way back in 2006 when this film came out, or even 4 years ago when his James Bond, spoiler alert, died in No Time to Die, which actually has turned out to be strangely fitting in a certain context. But we might get into some of that. But for now, let's just focus in on this film. It's funny. I was just thinking about when I saw this film, and it's the weirdest thing because I saw it actually when I was up in Gainesville, Florida, while my mom was in the hospital recovering from her heart transplant, which seems like so long ago, and yet this movie still feels so very fresh in my memory. And my memory is good of seeing the film. It's not like I was... It's one of those things when you're going through stressful situations and then sometimes going to a dark theater and seeing a fun movie is just what you need. And I remember just having an absolute blast seeing this in theaters. My expectations... I don't remember what my expectations were. I want to say they were probably high, even though I know there was a lot of doubting, a lot of dismissive attitude about Daniel Craig as a potential James Bond. But I went into the movie knowing that the film was being directed by Martin Campbell, who of course did probably my personal favorite Bond movie ever, Goldeneye. And a lot of that comes down to just the fact that was my first Bond movie, and the circumstances were unique because I was like not at all into like watching James Bond. Like, isn't that old franchise? My parents were hyping it up, and I was and then they were asleep within 30 minutes, and my eyes were glued to the TV. We talked a bit about that on the stream for that movie. So my love for that movie has always been high, and so knowing that the same director was coming back to do this one, I was like, oh no, it's going to be great. And I think what's so amazing is that you kind of be forgiven for not even realizing it's the same filmmaker, because it feels like such a wildly different film, and it's got such a different sort of vibe and even tone, and I feel like he made a perfect James Bond film for entering the 90s, and equally so made the sort of perfect Bond movie for the, what do we call those, the aughts. And so yeah, I think it's amazing that he made two very distinct James Bond films, and for my money, they're certainly my two favorite films of the franchise. But yeah, I adore this movie so completely. Just the movie itself, the sort of the grounded atmosphere of the film, but also I think it's the Daniel Craig film that has the most fun, which is why I also love it so much. And Daniel Craig himself is amazing. I think that this has the best quote unquote Bond girl, of the franchise. Eva Green is just beyond fantastic, and this was a great 1-2 punch for her. She had been in Kingdom of Heaven right before this, and then this came out, and and then we'll talk about all the rest of the cast. I mean, Mads Mikkelsen has to be one of the best Bond villains ever. So but yeah, headline is I love this movie, and it was just a joy getting to watch it again today.
No, I adore this movie as well. I personally think, as I alluded to earlier, that it is my favorite Bond film, and it is probably because it is the film that really didn't introduce me to Bond. I had seen Bond movies before, but this is the first Bond movie I really loved. And some of them I'd gone back and revisited. Obviously the earlier ones with Sean Connery. I do love Goldeneye as well. On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the George Lazenby film. But as you said, like in this era, there were other things and other franchises that kind of had my eye and my heart a little bit more than the James Bond movies. This movie came out in 2006. I believe I would have been a junior in high school at the time, and we were in the midst of a pretty, good run of these types of like down to earth, kind of super spy action thrillers or back to basics, origin, type stories, because the year before we had just had Batman Begins, which was a movie that I adored, and I think kind of helped inspire this movie's approach in certain ways. And perhaps the defining spy thriller of those early aughts was not actually James Bond. It was the new more grounded American version, the Jason Bourne series, which I was a big fan of. The first two films had been released at this time, and I
do want to like pause a second to just talk about like it was so the circumstances of that becoming the sort of blueprint for what a modern like spy action movie is so hilarious, because I remember when the first one came out, and it was kind of there was kind of this attitude of like, Matt Damon, really? But he pulled it off so well in the first film, and then by the Bourne Supremacy, you're not even batting an eye. You're like, oh my God, Jason Bourne is the most badass guy around. And so, yeah, that had certainly made waves and established a sort of a standard for that era of action filmmaking.
The thing about it is, it was coinciding with the end of the Pierce Brosnan era, which I think Goldeneye is one of the absolute best Bond movies, and I enjoy like a lot of the Pierce Brosnan films. But they had started to veer a little bit more into what some would consider the campier side of Bond at that time. And I think that some people were kind of searching for something a little bit different in that era, because it is also notable that, not to ground things too heavily, but like in between, around the time or shortly before the last Pierce Brosnan movie came out, a pretty big world event happened in the form of 9/11, and it kind of reset people's expectations about the nature of the world. And the thing about the James Bond films are that they originally came into being during the Cold War era, and they were that was kind of their archetype that they were set against. And even by the time you get to the Pierce Brosnan films in the mid 90s, they're already starting to reckon with the fact that the Cold War era is over, and how can we still tell James Bond stories with the central conceit kind of gone. And there's a lovely joke about it in this movie where M has the line, "Christ, I miss the Cold War." And it's like, that's a little nice meta bit there. But in particular, it's like, if we were going to tell a new version of Bond in this era, it didn't have to necessarily, change the DNA of the franchise, but it did have to take a somewhat different approach. And what I find so interesting about Casino Royale is the way that they chose to do that is by going back to the beginning and effectively rebooting the character, and in doing so, choosing to tell the very first James Bond story, Casino Royale, which had almost never been depicted on screen. And the only reason I say almost is because Mother Royan is mentioning in the chat the famous 1967 spoof version of James Bond, aka one of the two unofficial versions of Bond that exists out there, starring David Niven. And that one is not counted amongst the canon, but it's but it's notable because famously the family that controlled the Bond films, the Broccoli's, did not want to tell James Bond's origin story because they were like, this is, he kind of is, we don't want to see him when he's not fully formed. But things had changed, and so they ended up taking a very different approach into this movie, and again, perhaps inspired by some of those movies like the Bourne films and the Jason and the Batman Begins. But what I find so great about this movie is that it is still immediately recognizable as James Bond. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that Daniel Craig, who was one of the most controversial castings in history, it seemed at the time, absolutely defied everyone's expectations, and in many respects became the definitive Bond for this new era. Obviously Sean Connery kind of holds the standard as the original Bond, and for some he will never be surpassed, and I totally agree and respect with that position. But I will feel confident in saying that for my entry port into the franchise, Daniel Craig really became James Bond. His era of 5 films that remarkably spans 15 years, which is a stunningly long time frame for any actor to play Bond. They really feel of a piece. They are, perhaps the era of the franchise that tells the most consistent, overarching story and really focuses on, not just an individual adventure, but the life that this man has led and all the sorrows and heartbreak and trials that he goes through. And it's ultimately one of the reasons why I think it's fitting that if we are going to be entering a new era of Bond for a number of different reasons, that it feels like that Daniel Craig's James Bond is the one to kind of close it out, because he really did serve as a bridge to the new era and revitalize the franchise. And in many respects, the reason that he had such a successful run across the 5 movies, even with, some would argue some ups and downs, is because this first entry is just so strong and so like emotional and so exciting, and ultimately it feels to me like the quintessential James Bond story in many ways, and for that I love it, and I can't wait to delve more into it.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting. I think I will say, in terms of where the Bond franchise was before Casino Royale, I don't necessarily know that it was the campiness that had become the franchise's problem, because Bond was always campy. You look at the most revered of of the films, like you take Goldfinger, for example. It's a very campy movie. They all are. It's just that they had gotten Die Another Day especially had gotten so far-fetched with the stuff they were showing on screen. It was veering into like there was some like really hokey sci-fi stuff going on, and it wasn't necessary. And not to say Bond hadn't gone there before. I mean, look at Moonraker. It's just that at this particular time, audiences weren't, their appetite wasn't there for that kind of stuff. And yeah, the fact that Casino Royale is I hate it, because like between this and Batman, this is really where we got Reboot, where that came into the lexicon, and I will forever cringe at that. But yeah, it's definitely of a time that where that's the concept, and but it worked beautifully for the film, and yeah, it does feel kind of. It's weird, because you can definitely see this as a sort of transitional period, but also it also is a wonderful sort of, depending on what happens with the new iteration of Bond through Amazon, this is almost like a really fitting denouement, to the Bond that was, because I feel like it's taking that version of Bond as far as you can, as far as you could imagine, dramatically speaking, if you looked at Bond through a more serious lens. And it's really, and in light of all that, it makes, if we talk about, if someday we talk about A No Time to Die, it'll be really interesting to have a conversation about that film in the light of everything. But yeah, it's going to be strange moving forward, and it is fitting that this was the James Bond to either take us to the end or start a new chapter. But yeah, it's and then of course there's a lot of what I like most about it, and I kind of I want to focus on this movie, but I can't help but allude to some things from his other films. I do kind of like that Skyfall sort of winks at the audience in terms of what the actual continuity of these films are, because I think the fact that Skyfall was celebrating, what was it, the 50th anniversary of Bond at the time, made them want to sort of pay homage to the history of Bond. And so there's this feeling that Daniel Craig is actually playing the James Bond that's been through all 50 years. And so, as always, the sort of character continuity of Bond is always sort of in a state of flux. But for the purposes of this film, it's starting fresh, and this is when Bond, becomes quote unquote 007, and it's just great. It's a testament to the film that this one you don't even miss, elements like Q or Moneypenny, although there's a great nod to her in this film. And yeah, it's just telling a grounded but fun story about James Bond getting his start, but also setting in motion all the things that are going to be different about his iteration of Bond. This film is very, even if it's unintentional, it's actually setting things up that are going to define, the 4 films after this, and set it apart from all the other films. You mentioned a sort of consistent arc throughout the films, and I don't even know if it was intended at this point in the game, but it sort of, it sort of tricks the audience into thinking that by the end of this film, oh, Bond is now the Bond I recognize. This is who this guy is, and now we know who he's going to be moving forward. But actually, it's doing a bit of a trick there, because it's actually set things up that actually are going to, sort of highlight the ways in which his Bond is different throughout the next films. And the fact that this is going to be delving much more deeply into a very wounded character, and someone who actually maybe doesn't really want to be doing what he's doing. And it's a process of healing his soul over the course of the next few films. And so I just think it's a wonderful, as much as I won't lie, I really like the other Bond. I like the winks and the nods and the gadgets and the, hokey fun. But there's no doubt that this was a breath of fresh air when the franchise, I think, needed it. And I think it's going to stand out as very unique in the history of Bond.
And being Bond's quote unquote origin story for this version of the character, and ostensibly for the entire, mythology of the character, it really has one of the reasons it's so successful is because it doesn't just, go through the beats of saying yes, he needs his 2 kills to become 007. And we dispense with that in literally the first, 5 minutes of the movie. But really it's much more about who is this man, and who is specific, and the inherent contradictions that are at the heart of the character that make him so fascinating. And specifically the fact is that I think about the idea of sophistication and brutality. The fact that, the James Bond films have always been, quite violent, and, dealing with, terrible plots to destroy the world, and Bond has to kill a lot of people in very creative ways to stop those. But he does so with a very suave, as kind of like the upper crust of society, wearing the finest suits, drinking the finest, cocktails, wooing the finest women, and driving the finest cars. This is one of the reasons why, he kind of represents almost a wish fulfillment for some people. But at his core, there's also the nature that this film really delves into is, in many respects, it has, some people think of him as just a stone cold killer. And he is capable of being that. But he is also, that is ultimately not who he is at his core. It's why one of the most powerful thematic ideas that we'll be revisiting throughout this discussion ultimately is the idea of Bond's armor. And what he wears to kind of disguise his true nature, so not only he can do the job, but that so he can get through it without breaking in the way that many of us might break when going through such circumstances. He wears his suits and his smiles and his quips and his devil may care attitude as armor to protect himself in this world. But he is also very driven by a sense of, a burning need to prove himself at this stage, because again, this is a younger Bond who has not gone through hundreds of these missions. He if there isn't something that is driving him at the beginning, it is essentially his desire to prove that he is worthy of this mantle that he has now assumed as a 00. And in doing so, like, you know, we see him go through, like, in many respects, you know, when Eva Green's Vesper Lynn meets him, you know, for the first time, she calls him, you know, somewhat cheekily, a cold-hearted bastard. And in many respects, Bond kind of leans into that idea. But as we later see, you know, that is not ultimately who he is. You know, M also challenges him on this idea that he is, you know, like, she almost even though she needs him to be detached to do the things he's doing, she's almost concerned about how detached he presents himself. Like, there's the reaction when the woman he wooed, Solange, turns up dead, and Bond seems determined to, like, basically not show any emotion at all. And M is kind of like, I find it a little disturbing just how detached you're being about this, because ultimately, you know, the mission here is still to, you know, save lives and do good. And Bond is driven to do that. But what this movie ultimately does is it kind of cracks open the idea that he finds someone, specifically a person in Vesper, who does crack that armor. And then he can't keep himself closed away. He has to let her in. And of course, that's when he gets hurt. And that is the thing that ultimately kind of makes him so incredibly reluctant to open up in that way again. And it's what he spends the remaining 5 movies dealing with. And ultimately, by the time we reach No Time to Die, he has opened his heart again in a very beautiful way, just in time for the character to meet his end. But by that point, his arc feels truly complete. But in this movie, he goes through essentially what becomes the essential defining trauma of his life. And the fallout of that is heartbreaking, but also fascinating to watch.
Yeah. It's actually one of the reasons why I think that, even though it's not a movie without its faults, but I think Quantum of Solace is somewhat underrated, because it really deals with the fallout of the trauma he goes through in this film. And, you know, and talking about M calling him on, you know, him being shut off too much, that, you know, that comes to the forefront in one of the most disturbing scenes in the franchise, I think, in that film. And yeah, and I just think it's his take on the character, as well as all the writers that have and the directors and, yeah, everybody else who's contributed. It's just made it a very unique version of this character, because, you know, historically James Bond has been someone who, you know, he goes through, he, you know, saves the world, he kills all these people, and, you know, he loses people, and, you know, and he might be upset about it for a little bit, but then he's able to brush it off and he's fine by the next film. And there's a reason for that. And, you know, and we love that character, but there was something very, very wonderful about seeing this version, you know, for once, and watching, you know, what actually happens to someone who goes through, you know, these types of ordeals. And yeah, so I think they did such a beautiful job with all 5 films, but it all starts here. And it would not have, they would not have been able to do any of, you know, what followed if this movie hadn't worked in such an amazingly beautiful way. I feel like it kind of had to end up being one of the best Bond movies to work. That's an unfair burden to place on everybody involved. but I do think it had to be, you know, it had to be knocked out of the park, and they did it. It was just so amazing. I do want to make one more comment on, like, the criticism that Daniel Craig got right off the bat, which was absolutely insane. before anybody had seen even a second of footage. They were pouncing, and the one thing that always cracked me up was the fact that they called him Blonde Bond as a, sort of takedown or criticism. And I think it was Barbara Broccoli who said, "What are you talking about? Wasn't Roger Moore blonde?" And and it's true. It's like that was the stupidest narrative that was thrown out there by we know who those people are today. We very much recognize that section of the audience and that crowd of people. It's they didn't have. I don't think they had Twitter yet. It would have been even worse, but yeah, it's that all was silly, and thankfully everybody shut up once the film came out, because he proved all the naysayers wrong. Because like from the first moment you see him in this film, it's like, oh, I don't want to fuck with that guy.
Yeah, no, he joins a long, proud tradition of actors who like their casting was greeted with outrage because how could that actor play this iconic character? And then as soon as they show up on screen, you're like, oh, that's how. See Michael Keaton in Batman, or Christian Bale as Batman, or Heath Ledger as the Joker, just to cite a few options among many, many. But this is, but yeah, I do think that ultimately, also, it's kind of surprising to say at this point, but at this point in 2006, Daniel Craig was a relatively unknown actor. Now he feels like kind of, like one of our cultural titans because of not only his role as Bond, but, he's done great work in like the Knives Out movies and things along those lines. But
no, back then it was like, wait, is that the guy who was in the Tomb Raider movie with Angelina Jolie?
Yeah.
That's basically, or it did. I should say, something else that people could point to, and which was a much better showcase for his talents, was Road to Perdition, which he was fantastic in.
Yeah. No, I mean he was a great actor. It's just that people didn't really know who he was, as a lot of times people don't until you break out with a big role like this. But that kind of really gave him the edge to kind of define his Bond as not necessarily just portraying, a variation on the version of Bond that we had seen with, made with indelible by Sean Connery and, Roger Moore and George Lazenby and Pierce Brosnan and Timothy Dalton before him. This movie really kind of had the freedom, both because it was being set in modern times, and because of they were being made in the post 9/11 era, to kind of update Bond as a creature who is a lot. In some of the subsequent movies, they refer to him basically as like, somebody who's a bit out of time, like somebody who perhaps is like, we don't need heroes like this anymore because we have new technologies and we have new methods of fighting the evils of this world. And don't you think that this, basically thug who is, bursting through walls and shooting people and causing international incidents, isn't this just a bit outdated? And in many respects, it's like, this is the question the movie wants us to be asking, but it also wants us to recognize that, what Bond is doing is really, with his, his skills and his charm and his cleverness, it's like, this is why we will always need the human element in, these types of stories and in these types of people who defend us.
Well, that was also it was also a very popular theme in like spy action movies of that time, around the early to mid 2010s, because we saw that in Skyfall, and then we also saw it in Mission Impossible: Rogue Nation, where they're being like why do we need this secret organization that goes around playing dress up? And it's a very cheeky way of like explaining to the audience why they still want to go see these movies. But yeah, it's really great just the way they did. And you mentioned updating for the times, and this film actually has a mention of 9/11, which felt so initially it feels kind of weird because you're like, wait, does Bond take place in our world? But that's sort of, I think, done with a purpose, because the Bond films had started to get so outlandish that it does feel like they existed more in like a fantasy version of the world that we know. And this film was all about sort of grounding it and bringing it back down to a human level and saying, no, this is happening, like, you should take this seriously, this is happening in the world that we know, and the things that we've gone through have happened, and these characters are acknowledging that. But yeah, so I will say a nice way to sort of I want to talk about like some of those first impressions actually watching the movie of Daniel Craig's Bond, and by way of that we can kind of talk about the whole first 20 minutes of the movie, particularly in the scene where he's chasing the terrorist and through the construction site. And like, this was really the scene that sort of set the stage for like Bond as a complete and total badass. And I'm thinking of moments like when the bomb maker goes to shoot him, realizes he's out of bullets, throws the gun at him, Bond catches the gun throws it back at him, which is just so great. And then later on when he's chasing him down through the rest of the construction site, and you mentioned it, he just busts through a wall. And it's like, this is like, he's Captain America without being Captain America. He's still very human, and like he's he should be worried about injuries to his body, but he's got that kind of relentless energy and stamina that's just like, oh god, this guy is tough. And it just made for a hell of a first impression.
Yeah, no, the after we get the the black and white opening sequence, and then we move into the brightly colored Madagascar scenes that set the stage with the one of the big opening action sequence. This is where I really fell in love with the movie for the first time, just on a visceral level, because this is to date still one of my favorite action scenes in any movie. It's just so creative and so fun, and it has that essential visceral element of how the hell are they doing this? Because most of this is captured in camera. Obviously there's stunt doubles, obviously there's visual effects, but it really, one of the things that the Bond films have done in the past is they found, actors or people who have these extraordinary skills, and they have them put those skills on screen, whether that's like doing ski jumps off, mountains, or, flips off, off of moving aircraft. But in this case, the name I absolutely want to shout out and celebrate, the actor, Sebastian Foucan, who is what is known as a free runner. He actually was one of the early developers of what we have come to know as parkour, and so he's like an OG, yeah. And when you see him doing this stuff in the movie, you're like, that's something that no human being can do. And then it becomes even more fun when you realize this is one of the very first guys who actually did this and elevated it into into an art form. No wonder he's so fucking good at it. And it builds and builds and builds, and like, you know, and it starts with maneuvers. You're like, okay, well, that's really impressive, but I could see how that will happen, like when he grabs a bar and like uses it to jump through a window, and you're like, that's really cool. But then when he's doing maneuvers like leaping from moving cranes like several hundred feet in the air, you're just like, how is this possible for humanity? And how is Bond, who does not have these skills, how is he able to keep up with this guy? Well, he does so by being pretty creative, and also, again, kind of brutal and a little bit cavalier. You know, like I love the fact that this guy does this incredibly artistic, you know, maneuver to get over the fence and into the construction site. And then Bond's response is just to drive a fucking bulldozer through the fence after him. Or as you said, the fact that this guy, when he leaps through the window, you know, Bond smashes through the wall, or when he like jumps down and he bounces off the wall and bounces into a lower floor, and you're just like, how? And then Bond just gets on a one of those elevator things and just breaks it and just shoots down to the ground. You know, but when they're dueling up there on the crane, like that is just one of the moments where they're like.
And I do want to mention, like, there's a sort of visual callback, whether intentional or unintentional, but it did bring me back to the climax of Goldeneye.
Yeah.
With Bond and Alec Trevelyan, you know, fighting up, you know, on, you know, I don't know what you would call those that they're on.
Whatever the superstructures, yeah,
but high up in the air. So it felt similar but different enough to that, and it's. But then it's once it gets back to ground, that's when you're like, oh, holy shit! And you're right, it does have a sort of you know, a sort of relentless pace to it that seems to all culminate just when, you know, he takes him, you know, at the embassy, and like all of a sudden everything comes to a stop when he's like, well, I'm not going to be able to get out of here without a big distraction. So it's just a pause. And then, you know, in typical Bond fashion, he makes something blow up, you know, shoots the bomb maker and plows through the fence.
Yeah, that sequence was very, you know, GoldenEye video game kind of thing, kind of you know, logic there. But it's also like very, you know, it's both like a thrilling action climax, and again the fact that like somehow like this guy who is basically superhuman, Bond is he finally is like, I can't outrun this guy. I need to just take hiding, and then Bond like just follows him in there anyway and just grabs him and hauls him out until he's cornered, and then his response is to shoot him and to shoot the camera and blow everything up so he can make his escape. Fortunately, it seems like nobody else gets hurt other than the one bomb maker. But of course, as he says to M later, probably should have shot the camera first. This is why, you know, he's still Bond in his early days. You know, he causes a mighty little bit of an international incident here.
And I love when M says, you know, have you ever heard in your group of more, you know, self-righteous ass-covering pricks? Yeah, and that's where she says the whole line. She says, they don't care what we do, they care what we get caught doing. And then she has the line of, you know, I miss the Cold War.
In the old days, if an agent did something that stupid, he'd have the good sense to defect. I miss the Cold War. That actually works really well because I think, as Mother Roy had alluded to in chat, you know, Judi Dench is actually the one element that carried over from the previous Bond iterations. You know, she was in GoldenEye as the same character. And so it kind of feels apt that she's basically like, why can't things just be the way they used to be?
Yeah, and this is like, I go back to this whole idea of the James Bond franchise having this sort of loose continuity, because like if we're actually going like, first of all, if we were actually going back to James Bond's early days, for the franchise as a whole, it's way the wrong era, and also it's the wrong M. But it's set in, as we've established, it's set in the modern era, and so it's just sort of, it's a wink and a nod. It's M is carrying over from the Pierce Brosnan films, and really this is a fresh start for the character. Don't worry about the don't worry about the franchise continuity. And it's, I'm glad, because it's a lot of fun having her continue on, and then once we get to Skyfall, it really pays off amazingly, because we've had all, it's not just an M that we've grown accustomed to over the past 3 films. It's an M that we've known all the way back to Goldeneye, and we have this emotional attachment to her. And so yeah, I'm glad the Bond franchise never gets like they don't really care about canon that much.
Yeah, everyone out there who wants to make an explainer video how it's all one unified canon, or break out your string board, and draw those connections. Maybe there are better uses of your time. just kind of let this one ride.
I feel like the James Bond franchise makes the X-Men series look like they're on the ball with continuity. But yeah, no, it's why, like I've said time and time again, I've never gotten caught up and like bent out of shape over that. Like, if it makes sense for the story that's in front of me, and even if it doesn't, but if the movie's having fun with it, it's perfectly fine by me. And I'm glad we got to stick with Judi Dench, because she is by far my favorite version of that character.
Of course, yeah.
She has defined the character of M. And yes, I love Ray Fiennes, but he's never going to be Judi Dench
in this role. He has other great projects.
Yeah, it would have been interesting to see Judi Dench's take on Voldemort.
I was just thinking that. I think it's fitting, especially because Judi Dench is one of the very few iconic British actors who did not appear in the Harry Potter franchise, but I'm sure that they would have found a role for her.
Well,
maybe a new Harry Potter TV show.
Yeah, I was going to say there's actually still a chance. But yeah, no, and what I love is that, again, I feel like it's kind of inevitable to not sort of take in the other films in our discussion, especially since many of these actors will, cover lots of ground over those films. But, I loved her in the Pierce Brosnan films, but I think what they did so brilliantly with these 2 characters in the Craig films was really establish a sort of an emotional relationship between the 2 characters, and it's because they're, as much as she is a carryover from the other films, their dynamic is different here, because she has brought him up through the ranks and promoted him to 00 status, versus Brosnan's Bond, where she inherited this loose cannon she kind of is sick and tired of. And, she has her moments of that in these films. But it is a different dynamic that ultimately leads to a very emotional resolution with these 2 characters. And I think it is one of my favorite parts of the Daniel Craig films, especially.
Mine as well, because as you said, even though M and Bond are not biologically related, it becomes clear, especially by the point of Skyfall, that Bond is an orphan, famously, and M really is the closest thing he has to a mother figure. This is that does not mean that the relationship is easy. She clearly is tested by him in the way he does things. And like there are some great moments where he certainly seems to be pushing back against the boundaries of the rules that mommy would have set for her little 00 agent. The fact that he like breaks into her computer using her name and password. And does he know these things? Or when he breaks into her house and he's like, I thought M was a randomly assigned letter. I had no idea it stood for utter one more syllable. I'll have you killed.
And I do really love the Bond, don't ever break into my house again, only to then do it in Skyfall.
Yeah.
Oh.
But there is but there's obviously the reason it works is because there is clearly very real affection there on both sides, and one might even say love, platonic love, because frankly, after he breaks in, and she would have been within her rights to basically say not get out and never come back, she sits him down and has basically, she tries to teach him, she tries to impart a lesson to him where she's basically like, the reason I'm telling you not to do things this way is not just because I don't want to see you get hurt and cause an international incident. It's also because, this is, the life you have chosen as a 00, the life with a very short life expectancy, as Bond notes. It's hard and you're going to have to make hard choices. And I need to know I can trust you. Trust being a huge theme in this movie for multiple different reasons, and ultimately where while Bond's trust is tested at every single turn, we ultimately get the sense like there's never a dynamic where he doesn't trust that M has his best interest at heart, at least in this movie, and she ultimately still trusts him to do the job. Like when he tells her later, like, you knew I wouldn't let this drop, didn't you? And she's like, well, I knew you were you. And so that's why their relationship feels so, unbreakable. And then by the time we get to Skyfall, it's like why they're willing essentially to fight to the death to protect one another.
And I will say, even though, we had already, sort of bestowed the crown of best Bond girl upon, a certain actress that we're going to talk about in a second here. I think it's only really on a sort of technicality with her being the M character that we don't sort of say that Judi Dench is the sort of all-time or quote unquote Bond girl, across these films, but also especially in Skyfall. And I think it's a testament to these films, honestly, that they really challenged like our conception of what a Bond girl, is, because I honestly think that, these films overall have just had, the best of the franchise when it comes to Bond girls. You've got Vesper Lind, you have M, Madeline Swan, I think is also one of the very best, and obviously one of the most important. I think it's of the many elements to which these films have sort of raised the bar and sort of charted brave new territory. I think that was one area, especially where they did that.
Yeah, and this is an area where, again, the Bond franchise had to evolve with the times because, the way our society has evolved, in this case, I would argue for the better. It's like there is some stuff that we just accept as part of the cultural times from the Bond movies of the 60s that if you tried to do it today, unironically, it would not have passed muster with, a lot of the modern audiences, and they make a nods to that, but they also respect the fact that the Bond girls are an essential part of the James Bond story. So it's not like we're going to do away with that trope entirely. We're going to treat them more as like complex characters than funny names with,
But also, I'm sorry, I'll still take a Xenia on a top in the future.
Of course, of course. I'm more thinking about like the fact that yes, it's like the names are, the names are where they can have just more good-natured fun with it. Like, yes, like Xenia on a top, and Honey Rider and Pussy Galore and Christmas Jones and all these crazy names, and we get a nods to it, of course, with not only Vesper Lind, and he's like, I do hope you gave your parents hell for that, although Vesper is actually not a very out there name, but also like when he gets the documents and they're doing the art, and he's like, I'm Mr. Arlington Beach, and you're Miss Stephanie Broadchest.
Oh no, I'm not. You don't have to trust me on this.
And it's like, that is a name that would have been a Bond girl name, unironically, back in the 60s, and may have actually been. But this is where they recognize that they have to.
Somebody had an idea for what Amazon might do with the franchise, and as much as I am sort of horrified by the notion of like, cinematic universing the whole thing, but somebody did mention the idea of doing like different Bond films that would be like, or even TV shows that would be in different eras, and allow them to sort of play with the formula in that way. And you could do a film that is set back in the 60s. And if that was an idea that they went with, you might have a bit more license to do some tongue-in-cheek stuff, paying homage to the older films. But I don't know. That's just who knows what's going to come up that. We shall have to wait and see. But yeah. Speaking of Bond girls, I just do kind of, we've already kind of established this, but this is a movie that's so rooted in character. It certainly does have its plot, but it's so rooted in character that I just kind of want to jump around and just talk about the elements of the film rather than try and go through every beat of it. Let's talk about the great Eva Green as Vesper Lind. Like, I loved her in Kingdom of Heaven, particularly the director's cut, which is where most of her character arc got lost and eventually ended up. But this was the one where I like fell head over heels. I was like, oh my God, she's amazing. And yes, so very gorgeous, but also just her performance was incredible. The character is amazing. I just like, from the moment she steps on screen, the way she just enters the frame, flops down on the seat and goes, I'm the money, she just owns the screen, immediately.
No, I mean, I make no bones about it. Like, Eva Green's Vesper Lind is my favorite Bond girl in the entire franchise. And I think that would have been the case if it was just this movie, and this movie remained a perfect standalone film. But the way her character lingers through the remaining 5, Bond, Daniel Craig Bond movies, I feel it's appropriate because she left such an indelible impression, not only on, us as the audience, but for Bond specifically as a character. Like, this is one of the very few Bond girls in the franchise who you can say definitively that James Bond was actually, truly, sincerely in love with. The others being, in Her Majesty's Secret Service, the great Diana Rigg, and then Madeline Swan, obviously later in this current run. But this, again, this essentially being James Bond's origin story. In many respects, Vesper is meant to be the first, the first who actually cracks his armor and makes him realize that there is perhaps something more to life than this game and this, this stop that he has chosen to play, this game of espionage and double dealing and, and violence and death. and the way that she goes about that is actually, incredibly effective because, Eva Green is obviously, she portrays Vesper as very confident, very, very intelligent, very capable, but not necessarily, like a warrior in a traditional sense, like she's capable of picking up a gun and defending herself, but she's not, she's not one of these previous iterations who like is basically like playing an assassin or or someone who can is actually someone who Bond tangles with on a more adversarial level. She is she presents herself as as the accountant from the Treasury, and kind of the joke is meant to be that
and that is what she is. And and there's a scene later on where yes, like she, when Bond's in a fight for his life, she goes and she knocks the gun out of the guy's hand, but then Bond proceeds to strangle said guy, and she's absolutely horrified and traumatized by that event. She is not. She works for the government, but she's an accountant. She's not. She's not a spy. No. And so, but she has such. But especially once you go back and you understand what her character is actually going through over the course of the film, she is incredibly strong.
Yes.
And her will is strong. Her resolve is strong, and she has one hell of a wit. Like just her back and forths with James are so great. I mentioned that first scene where they introduce her, and the back and forth between the two of them is like, I remember I was watching this movie with my mom, and this was the scene when it was over. She was like, and this is my mom who like will not would not always necessarily recognize this or call these things out, but she was like, oh, this has a great script, and it's just their back and forth banter is such a highlight of this film. And just when they're sort of dressing each other down and telling each other their own reads on the other person. It's so fun to watch. And it's like instantly you're like, oh, these two are absolutely crazy about each other. They just don't necessarily realize it yet.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and that's where like their initial adversarial dynamic is fun and playful because when she plops herself down and introduces herself, I'm the money, every penny of it. We can instantly recognize that this is the kind of, flirtatious dynamic that we have seen Bond have with many of the previous iterations of Bond girls, but very rarely has one been managed to sustain it with such, quick and cutting wit as Eva Green's Vesper Lynd does here. Because, she, because Bond has his kind of easy charm and his confidence that, as she says, often borders on arrogance, but she knows she has an inherent understanding of where to cut him, necessarily, like the fact that, like, even when he's just, seems very confident about the prospect of his, he's like, you don't think this is a very good plan, do you? And she's like, there is a plan.
There is a plan. And I love also when their conversation ends and she's like, so as charming as you are, Mr. Bond, I will be keeping my eye on our government's money and off your perfectly formed ass. You noticed. Even accountants have imaginations. How is your lamb? Steward, unsympathizing.
One sympathizes, yes, because he he's beaten there, and it's notable that even as she says she will be keeping her eyes off his perfectly formed ass, she kind of gives him a little once over there. And their whole dynamic about the where they're talking about essentially the nature of bluffing and poker, and they're reading each other, and they both, they size each other up, and it's implied, even though neither one of them directly acknowledges it, that they essentially size each other up pretty well. Like the fact that he pegs the fact that she is an orphan and she is somewhat, insecure, so she perhaps wears slightly more masculine clothing and has a somewhat prickly demeanor that ironically makes it her less likely to be accepted by her male colleagues, which again, very real world thing there. And then the way she just is like, all right. And then she proceeds to do it to him, where she's like, but by the cut of your suit, you went to Oxford or wherever, and actually think people dress like that, but you wear it with such disdain that makes me think that you didn't actually come from money. And, which makes me think you were at the school by the grace of someone else's charity. And because your thoughts went to orphan, that's what I would say you are. Oh, you are? I like this poker thing. And yeah, it goes on to the fact that that like she clearly is one of those people, as I had mentioned earlier, who in character, separate from everything else that's going on behind the scenes, kind of sees Bond as an antique, the sexist dinosaur that he has been, branded as pejoratively by some people. And he kind of is, again, kind of playing into that as a way to show that it's like, yes, I don't care. I'm going to be able to do this job anyway. But ultimately, you can see that they're both enjoying this exchange, and even though, like, ultimately, like I do think that at least on her end, it actually is like more like leaning into the enmity of it rather than the intrigue. There's the spark there that just never. Again, this is chemistry you can't fake.
Yeah.
If the fact that these two are going to be spending time together almost against their will and having to pose as lovers for the sake of this duty that they have to perform, they kind of come to the conclusion, definitely Bond and eventually Vesper is like, all right, if that's what we have to do, why not enjoy it a little bit? And in doing so, ironically, that kind of pretend affection actually becomes very sincere.
Yeah, and it's just, and she just, it's such a beautiful performance because much like with Bond, as the film goes on, you get to sort of peel back her layers more and more and see what's underneath. And we don't have to talk about the ending of the movie just yet, but I like how as the film gets closer to its resolution, you can really see her starting to crack under the pressure of everything that's going on. And yeah, it's just, it's beautiful, tragic, just charismatic, fun performance. And then of course, we just got to talk about the dresses. I'm sorry, it's a thing. She looks utterly fantastic throughout this movie, and I'm thinking of when Bond tells her to wear the purple dress and to distract the other players, and then she ends up walking in the direction, and so that and then he's the one who's distracted, and and it's just so much fun.
And their great banter when they're handing off because he buys her this dress to wear it, and she's like, something you expect me to wear? It's like, I need you looking fabulous. So when they you walk in and behind me and kiss me on the neck, the players across from you are thinking about your neckline and not about their cards. Can you do that for me? I'll do my best. And does she? Because not only does she do that for him, but she also, she buys him the dinner jacket. And it's the first time we see Bond almost go a little bit nonplussed when he's like, I have a dinner jacket. There are dinner jackets and dinner jackets. This is the latter. How? It's tailored.
I sized you up the moment we
Well,
met.
yeah.
And then, like, this is actually, I've got more I want to say about Eva Green, so I'll just sort of dip into this for a second and we'll expand upon it in a little bit. But then when he walks in front of the mirror, this is one of those moments where the score is just amazing. And what's great about it is that, except for the very end of the movie, the quote unquote James Bond theme is not heard once in the film. And the theme that we get repeated throughout the film is actually the new theme written for the song I Know Your Name, sung by Chris Cornell in the opening credits. But it is orchestrated and played throughout the film as if it's the classic Bond theme, and David Arnold's score as a whole is, steeped in the tradition of James Bond, of the John Barry classic scores, and the work that David Arnold did in the Pierce Brosnan movies, and it's actually why it's one of the contributing factors as to why this is my favorite of the Daniel Craig movies, because of the score. And it just, even as the rest of the movie is doing something, going in new directions with the character, the score grounds it as Bond and gives it the flavor of Bond, while also in its own way going back to basics, because even the Pierce Brosnan movies, which were steeped in, particularly Tomorrow Never Dies, was steeped in that great orchestral, blaring horn tradition of Bond music. It too had its electronic elements as a score of the 90s. And this film has just a beautiful classic orchestral score that is, as classical and sort of back to basics as you can get. And so, and the fact that they wrote such an amazing theme exclusively for this film, that you don't even think, oh, that's not the classic James Bond theme. It becomes one of James Bond's most memorable musical themes, just by virtue of this film. And then, of course, at the very end, the classic music comes in just the most perfect way. But yeah, I just want to highlight that, because that moment when he steps in front of the mirror and he's looking at himself, and Vesper is looking at him, and she's having a little chuckle, just watching with that music in the background. It's just like, yeah, this is Bond.
Yeah, no, I will note, just to keep a note on the music here, is the theme for this movie, you Know My Name by Chris Cornell of Soundgarden, is one of my favorite Bond themes. I feel like, some of the latter Bond themes in this series have been obviously iconically celebrated, like, Skyfall from Adele and No Time to Die from Billie Eilish, and I love those as well. But I remember that this was one that I instantly loved when I watched the movie for the first time. And as you said, I almost forget that it's not the actual Bond theme because of how effectively it's used throughout the movie. It's just like, when that music plays, I'm like, yeah, that's the Bond theme. And it's like, no,
because it sounds like Bond, and that's like, and that's one of the things that I would really hammer home to composers of future Bond movies, is like, you can come up with your own themes and do your own things, but it better damn well sound like Bond. Don't give me a bunch of techno electronic stuff with no connection to classic Bond. You've got to make it sound like Bond. And I will say, to Hans Zimmer's credit, he made his score sound like Bond when he did No Time to Die. And then I was very impressed by that. And it's, the music is incredible. But anyway, back to Eva Green, before I think we'll pause after we finish talking about her, do the mid-roll. She just has this charisma about her, that, and she's doing what I love is that something that made her even like this performance soar even beyond what I saw in Kingdom of Heaven, was she was getting to play a very British person in this movie, which is always fun. And there's a part in that first conversation where I can't remember what her actual line is, but she delivers it with such like wonderful Britishness that it's something about the line where she says, you know, former SIS types, give, no thought at all to sacrificing everything for king and country. And it's just, it's so quintessentially British, the way she says the line. And yeah, it's just, you can tell that she's having a ball with the role.
Yeah. No, I mean, and she, as we said, she gives as good as she gets, constantly, which I think is one of the things Bond finds so fascinating about her. But, we talked a little bit earlier about Bond's kind of wounded heart, and like that is ultimately what makes Vesper such a rich and fascinating character as well, and why she and Bond are ultimately like truly, soulmates in a way. The fact that when, we had mentioned that after the kind of the brutal fight scene against Obano, when Vesper has to leap into action to help Bond, and all she does is get the gun away from him, but then she has to watch as Bond slowly strangles the life out of this man. And then Bond is basically tells her to just go and, get this cleaned up because he has to go back to the poker game. But then when he comes back to the apartment later, and he finds her just sitting in the shower and basically in shock, still fully clothed, still like eyes staring off into the distance. And we see a completely different side of him and of her, where he, steps into the shower, again, fully clothed, not caring about, that kind of appearance at all, and just kind of embraces her. And she grabs onto him, both as just kind of like a sense of human connection, but also because I think she does specifically feel connected to him in this moment because he went through this with her. And the way she just is whispering, like there's blood on my hands, it's not coming off. And just the gentle, intimate way where he takes her hand and he kind of puts her fingers in his mouth and kind of gently pretends to suck the blood off, and he's like, there, is that better? And she's just like nodding and trembling, and he kind of adjusts the temperature of the water, and they just sit there. And it's such a beautifully staged scene, very minimally, like minimal dialogue and very few like frills around it. But this is where the bond is truly like forged. These two characters have dropped the artifice that they have been cloaking themselves in, armoring themselves in this moment, and they're recognizing that they are sharing something here, and they are just content to sit in that moment and feel it. And once that's happened, there was a couple scenes later where they try to go back into their usual like flirtatious, kind of biting dynamic, but it never has quite the same, sharpness. Or when it does have that sharpness, it feels much more like designed in like a defensive posture of rather than like fun and flirtatious, because at this point they've recognized, I have let you in, you have seen the real me, and I know you can hurt me, and that scares me. And ultimately it's their journey to recognize that no, perhaps what we have can actually be something, more, can be something beautiful. But in the moment, they're still going through an incredibly tense situation, and these two characters, like, this is something neither one of them have really ever gone through before. And so watching them feel it out is, incredibly tense, but also beautiful.
Yeah, it's a scene that is like dealing very fairly with the trauma of what she's just gone through, but it's also very, very sweet, very delicate. Still, it's still a Bond film, so it is also very sensual, but it's done in a respectful manner and feels true to the characters and what they're going through. And yeah, I think it was, I was watching a documentary. I can't remember who exactly it was that said this. It might have been the director, Martin Campbell, said that like this is the moment when the two characters fall in love. And yeah, it's just, it's, you know, I'll say this about many scenes in this film, but it's just one of the most beautiful moments out of the entire franchise. And yeah, it's absolutely wonderful. And it's just a testament to how well both Daniel Craig and Eva Green played off each other. And yeah, it's just beautiful. I love her performance in this movie, and you know we'll talk about a bit more about you know where the character ends up as we get towards the end of the stream. But yeah, it's just like she has without a doubt earned, you know, I think at the end of the day I am just in full agreement with you that like she is definitely like my favorite quote unquote Bond girl. And that somehow like I say that because that's just what, you know, what we what we call them, but it seems in some way it seems somewhat dismissive of the complex character work that's going on here and by many of the actresses throughout this throughout these films. And but yeah, she's so damn good. And not to get more what's the word I'm looking for? Oh God, why is my mind I can't think of the word I'm thinking of. It's the one I often use. Oh yeah, more superficial. Not to get more superficial. But you know, I was looking through the production stills for this movie, and I'm just gonna bring this one up. Hey, they took the picture. I'm just showing it. Okay.
No, I mean Eva Green is just stunningly gorgeous, and I like this movie. You know, plays into that to great effect while still recognizing that ultimately what we love about her, what Bond loves about her, is the fact that she is not just her pretty face, she is her fierce intelligence and her, you know, immense charm. But again, that's like, this is one of the reasons why, like, ultimately the conventions of her being a Bond girl, like, it's not a label we need to reject. You know, it's like she is every bit as stunning, you know, in this movie as, you know, Ursula Andress was coming out of the water. So, and it's just a different tone.
Yeah. Yeah, no. It's, yeah, I don't want that's why I almost hesitated putting it up, because you know I have to, because she's gorgeous, and I saw the picture, I wanted to show it, but it's yeah, what she does across the board. Yes, she looks gorgeous, as you know, Bond girls always do, but like you know we've said, her performance was just beyond words, just so amazing. And we are still going to talk some more about where she goes at the end of this film. And it's a beautiful performance. And yeah, I just absolutely fantastic. And yeah. And I do love the fact that like she has her character has such a ripple effect throughout the rest of these films, which I think just, you know, there's a scene early in No Time to Die, which I was really happy to see in there, just because it felt like it was really taking in Bond's whole journey, and the effect that she had on him, and it shows that he's kind of healed, you know, and come to a sort of better place about the relationship than what we see at the end of this film, which we will talk about. Okay, let's pause for a second here. We're an hour and a half in, and we've got more amazing characters and story threads to talk about when we jump back in. Just want to talk a bit about what we've got ahead, because we've kind of sort of semi-solidified a couple things. And next week, on March 23rd, we'll be talking about Andor Season 1 in preparation for the second season coming out in late April. And I am just so beyond excited about this. I'm just really ready to enter back into the world of Andor, and that sort of, even though I'm not feeling great about the sort of similarities to reality, especially with reading the book Mask of Fear, which is doesn't take place in the same time as Andor, but it deals with a lot of the same story threads, and I'm like, yeah, this made me feel a little uneasy. But it's really compelling drama, and I can't wait to get back into it. So we're going to talk about season 1 of that show next week, and then we're going to be off for 2 weeks because you're going to be out of town, Jared.
Yes, I am. I'm going on a 2-week vacation through Europe with some friends. I'm going to be hitting Croatia, Slovenia, Austria, and the Czech Republic. And so I'll be hopefully getting to see some cool sites, get some cool pictures, maybe visit some filming locations that for some franchises and movies that we have loved and discussed. Game of Thrones has a history in Croatia, and a couple of movies we've talked about in the past have filmed in those countries as well. So, but ultimately, I'm just looking forward to getting some time away from work with some good friends. And I'm sorry I'll be away from the channel for 2 weeks, but we all need to take that time. That's on occasion, and then we'll be back.
Well, what's great is I'm just going to be able to plunge myself in completely to to watching other stuff, and so for 2 weeks I won't have to quite worry about, oh wait, what do we talk about the channel on Sunday? And so, which I enjoy every week, but sometimes it is nice to not have to worry about that too. So we'll be off for those 2 weeks. We'll be back on April 13th. We haven't quite nailed down what we're going to do yet, but I can sort of tease a little bit of it. We're going to be trying something new. We're going to not be focusing on a singular topic. We're going to be doing something a bit more abstract. And if that sounds cryptic, it's because we haven't actually figured out what that thing is yet. But it's going to be, it won't be outside of our wheelhouse. It'll be related to the art of film, cinema, or television. We don't know yet. But it'll be sort of a wider discussion about some things. I have a couple of ideas about what it might be, but we'll save that for next week when after Jared and I have a chance to talk about it. But I think it's something that we wanted to do for a while, and it just works out good because you're getting back a couple days before that, and I feel like by doing this kind of discussion, you won't have to worry about any prep. We'll just show up and start talking.
Yeah, I might still be a little bit tired, but I don't want us to take 3 full weeks off. So I'm happy to have that discussion because I'm sure we will find a topic that is relevant to everything that we have already discussed on this channel and celebrating our love of film but perhaps taking a step back, and rather than just focusing on a single movie or single TV show, maybe looking at some of the wider trends of what we're seeing. And we have done stuff on this channel like this before, not maybe exactly in the format, but I believe that earlier in your channel's history, Gwyn, you had a series of things called, I believe, the Focus On discussions. Yeah, which were usually more an actor or a director or something.
Yeah, and to be clear, we won't be doing that, but kind of taking a wider view out. I did figure out when I did the Focus On director thing with AR, and we did a stream on Quentin Tarantino, and we actually found out that actually ended up screwing us because we felt inclined to rewatch all the films of his that we were talking about, and it was just so much more work for us. Yeah. So like, I don't know why I felt the need to do that. It's like, it's not like I'm unfamiliar with his movies. but yeah, so the goal here for this one is something that we are already, you know, a topic that we're well versed in, and we can just sort of just wax poetic about, you know, a certain, and not like a certain, you know, not a director or an actor or a franchise or anything, but sort of a wider discussion about film in some regard. So like I said, that's cryptic. We'll have details for you next week. The week after that, we know what we're going to talk about because it's the weekend of Star Wars Celebration, and it's going to be I'm so happy that this Star Wars Celebration is very animation focused, and it gave me a wonderful excuse to do something that I've actually been thinking about lately, which is on that Sunday, we are going to talk about the 4-episode arc, which was also known as the Clone Wars finale, The Siege of Mandalore, which I've done a discussion over on Here Be Dragons with Steven Nessie about the final season of Clone Wars. And so we did talk about the Siege of Mandalore, but I've never done a discussion that's just focused on those 4 episodes. And it just sounds like a whole lot of fun to me. And so I suggested this to you. You were on board, and I'm like, hell yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, no, I mean, you did not need to twist my arm to talk about Star Wars, and especially the Siege of Mandalore, which is an astonishing finale to an all-time great show in the Clone Wars. And I feel like we have already gushed about it in like somewhat proximity in the fact that like when we did our Revenge of the Sith discussion, we kept bringing the Siege of Mandalore into it. This will be fun to kind of go from the other where we have our primary focus on the Siege of Mandalore, and I'm sure we'll talk about Revenge of the Sith as well, because, you know, it'll be returning to theaters for its 20th anniversary the following weekend, and we could be looking forward to that as well. But yes, as you said, Star Wars Celebration will be that week. They are screening the Siege of Mandalore over in Japan, which neither one of us will be at, but this will be our own celebration. And as you know, that they have confirmed at their 20th anniversary of Lucasfilm Animation panel that they will be giving us a glimpse into what awaits us in the future, which to us means what's the next animated show.
So hopefully we'll be able to talk about that, because that'll presumably be announced a couple of days beforehand, and we'll get to talk about that. That was definitely on my mind when I suggested this, and yeah. So that'll be a lot of fun. I'm just like, I'm so bitter about the fact that this is the celebration where they're pushing animation, and it's all the way over in Japan, and I was never ever gonna go to this one. But it also makes sense just because of how important animation is over in Japan. So yeah, but like, if I had known that, maybe I would have moved heaven and earth to go to this one. Who knows?
I considered going, but ultimately it just, again, the timing didn't exactly line up, especially given other vacation plans. So next time it's stateside, we'll hit it there. But in the meantime, I'll just be looking forward to hearing all the news out of Celebration about Andor, Mandalorian, and Grogu, Star Wars Visions, which we will also be getting Volume 3 this year, and looking forward to that. But then, yes, also, what's the next animated show? Let's go.
I am feeling a little bit smug about them pushing animation so much at this celebration, because it's not a coincidence that this is coinciding with a significant slowdown in live action Disney Plus content. Which they may have realized that they can't keep pouring so much money into all that, and that, hey, animation doesn't cost as much, so maybe we should swing the focus back in that direction a little bit. And so I'm like, yeah, I'm feeling happy about that. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they announce. coming out of this celebration. And I'll be very happy to have CouchCon at home. And even though we won't see everything, we should still hopefully see, see enough that, will be fun to watch at home. So yeah, that's going to be fun. I can't wait to talk about it. Siege of Mandalore is one of my absolute favorite Star Wars stories of all time. And yeah, we'll have a lot of fun doing that. After that, on April 27th, we will be off again because that time I will be out of town because I am going to be going to Chicago to see many of our friends and hang out for a couple days. So that's going to be fun. And then when I come back from that, we have a whole month full of stuff in May. We're going to be talking about Andor Season 2. We're going to be talking about the director's cut of Kingdom of Heaven, which I mentioned earlier in the stream. And on May 25th, we're going to be kicking off our discussion of the original Star Wars trilogy with the 1977 classic film. So yeah, lots of fun stuff, lots of Star Wars, which you pointed out to me when I suggested the Siege of Mandalore, and I was like, I don't care. We love Star Wars. Let's do it.
I don't care either. I have noted that, we do try to, talk about a range of things on the channel, and it just we go through bursts, with a lot of Star Wars, but then we haven't talked about Star Wars since we did Skeleton Crew in early January. So, we're champing at the bit to get back to it for a little bit.
Well, plus, and we're talking about a lot of different Star Wars things. Like nobody mistakes Clone Wars and Andor as being the same thing. They're very different. So I think we'll still have a lot of variety. So
just wait until Meeber Gascon shows up in Andor Season 2, as Ken Napzok keeps hoping.
Oh God, I am hoping to see Meeber, show up in something. I have not given up hope on that. Will it be Andor? No, I think not. but who knows? And especially, if we're going to be getting more animated content, there's always the possibility for him to show up. So we'll see. Okay. And what else was I? Oh yeah, was just trying to show off. Since I always like to show off all my physical media for the topic that we're talking about. I already showed my soundtrack for Cinderella earlier, but now I'll show off my soundtrack CD for Casino Royale, which I love dearly. Got this a couple years ago I think I got it on like an Amazon seller, and was very happy about that. And I've got here to show off an older DVD collector's edition of Casino Royale, which is very nice. Even as I've upgraded to Blu-ray, this is, a very nice edition, which, I've always got to keep these deluxe editions. And then at the same time, around the same time as that, they also released a matching Blu-ray edition, which I have as well. So, and this still holds up insanely well. This is a 2008 Blu-ray, but honestly, it stands up with the best of what's offered today. So, but oh yeah, and one more thing I wanted to show off, which I haven't really shown. I'm wearing a new shirt today. I got myself a Vi shirt from Arcane, which her being her wonderful badass self. So had to make sure to show that off. I was very happy to find this at the mall. I've got a Jinx shirt to go along with it as well. So
nice. I actually had purchased an Arcane shirt myself from Heroes and Villains, the online store, and it's Echo, my boy Echo. I'm not wearing it today because I'm wearing a Bad Batch shirt that I got from the same outlet. So.
Yes, we got to make sure we do this because we can't miss that opportunity. It would be so great to see Mother One. Yeah, I'm just it's weird. I'm like I'm psyched about going to Chicago, but also like until we get closer to it, it still kind of feels like almost sort of not real because it's not until the end of April. So I'm just like, I need to get within a couple weeks of it, and then I can start getting officially really excited. But yeah. Okay, so let's dive back in. Let's switch gears and talk about another major cast member of this film. And speaking of Star Wars, he's also a Star Wars alum, Mr. Mads Mikkelsen. Both the Mikkelsen bros are a member of the Star Wars family, but in this film, Mads plays Le Chiffre, an iconic James Bond villain, if there ever was one, who actually, cries blood or has tears of blood. Yeah, it's he's one freaky dude, but such a great character.
Yeah,
and honestly, I think he would be, the undisputed like best villain of these movies if it hadn't have been for Silva in Skyfall. And like I'm just fine not choosing between the two of them because they're so good, but Silva has such a personal connection to the character of M and Bond, and it's so yeah, it's a tough call, but we don't need them to compete. We're talking about this movie, and Le Chiffre is just totally awesome and a great character, and yeah, it's like he embodies menacing as soon as we see him.
No, Mads Mikkelsen is one of my favorite working actors, and this is kind of the role that really kind of launched him into that space for me. It's not the first thing I ever saw him in because I had seen him in the 2004 version of King Arthur as Tristan in that movie, but.
He's so nice and gentle in that film.
which he can do. He can play both. I mean, but it is undeniably true that he has his nice guy roles like Tristan in King Arthur and Galen Erso in Rogue One. He is more known these days for playing the baddies, for playing the villains. In particular, I will just note that my single favorite performance of his, and one of my favorite performances of any actor in any project, movie, or TV show, is his role as Dr. Hannibal Lecter on the TV show Hannibal. I think he might actually be the best version of Hannibal Lecter, even given Anthony Hopkins' Oscar-winning performance.
Which I still have not seen it in its entirety. I have seen the first couple episodes of the series back when it premiered, but then I fell off for whatever reason. And it's always been this thing like, and yes, I know the show didn't get to finish its run, but it's still something that I desperately want to watch. And so one of these days I might get to it.
I mean, it definitely leans into, the horror vibes a bit, but it's I find it's, even though it's a dark and disturbing and violent show, it's actually a show I think you could probably handle, Gwen, because it's not reveling in those elements for exploitation.
Well, and to be clear, I really enjoy the Hannibal Lecter movies, so yeah, I'm game for it.
Yeah, no, and again, he is phenomenal in that show, as is Hugh Dancy as Will Graham, and so many other
which Hugh Dancy, another actor who was in King Arthur,
which is again is one of the reasons when they were both cast, I was like, yay, King Arthur reunion, but then it became so much more than that, obviously. But to bring a focus back to this movie, one of the reasons I was so excited for Mads Mikkelsen to play Hannibal Lecter in the Hannibal TV show and other franchises is because of his role as Le Chiffre in this film, because he just the overwhelming word I would use to describe it, ironically, given what he says about his own tear duct, I would describe him as a very sinister presence. Even though he says, weeping blood is merely a derangement of the tear duct, nothing sinister. But you're sinister enough even without that. Mr. Lashif.
It's like, I don't believe you.
I don't believe you. Yes, because again, he is not the most physically imposing villain in the world. But one of the reasons I find him so effective is because, in many respects, as the best villains are, they are kind of the mirror to the hero, in embodying some of their, perhaps worst qualities and kind of putting those into sharp relief for the audience. Because we had talked earlier about the fact that, Daniel Craig's James Bond, he presents himself in many respects as a cold-hearted bastard, but ultimately that is not what truly lies within. He has, he is capable of great empathy and humanity, and he ultimately does care and has a moral center. Lashif does not. Lashif is very much ice, like his heart is made of ice and pitch black, just greed to his very core. From his opening scene where he's talking to he's talking to Obano, the African, militant, and they're talking about their bank. He serves as a banker to the world's terrorists, which tells you not a good dude. But then the guy kind of looks at him, trying to intimidate him, and says, "Do you believe in God, Mr. Lashifra?" And he says, very matter-of-factly, "No, I believe in a reasonable rate of return." And then just other little affectations throughout these movies, like the fact that he, when Obano comes back mad that his money has been wasted away, and threatens Lashif's girlfriend and basically is going to cut her arm off, and he brings the machete down within inches of it, and she's screaming and pleading, and Lashif says nothing, absolutely nothing. And Obama notes that he's like, not a word of protest. You should find a new boyfriend, which she does not, notably.
Which I am going to pause here just to sort of pay homage to the wonderful Ivana Miličević. Maybe I'm not saying her last name right. I apologize if not. She has been in many more things besides this. And actually, her performance in this is largely a non-speaking role. For the most part, but she is in that grand tradition of like, now this is a total fit in the archetype of the Bond girl, or rather the Bond femme fatale.
Yeah, exactly.
But she has a great presence in the movie, and and she was in another show that I didn't watch the whole thing, but I've seen parts of it, called Banshee. She's really great in that, and she's been in numerous other things. So yeah, just wanted to give her a shout out.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, there are lots of great actors. I'll also, just because we mentioned him, I'll shout out Isaac Debencole, who plays Obano, the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army, who kind of serves as a minor antagonist for not only for Lashif, but for Bond as well. But again, the thing about Lashif is that he very much is the cold, calculating, heartless bastard that Bond pretends to be. Lashif is that man. He cares about nothing, absolutely nothing, other than, as he says, his reasonable rate of return, and of not dying from the terrorists that he has fucked over by investing their money in a stock market scheme that then went awry thanks to the efforts of Mr. Bond. But he is, but it shows that he is very, calm and cool and collected. He's a mathematical genius, as they say. It makes him a brilliant poker player. And he is a very formidable adversary in that arena as well. But it's also all the more thrilling to see him like be that cool and collected customer, and then as Bond starts to finally try to work out the way to beat him, start to see those edges start to fray a bit until we finally get him in the scene where he has lost almost everything, and then the real monster comes out.
Let's just we'll jump back and talk about some of the earlier stuff, but yeah, the scene where he's torturing Bond is just one for the ages. You know, it's like, because it is, yeah, he's very sinister, but that scene is also, as dark as it is, it's also, pardon me, fucking hilarious.
Word for it.
I think it is. If you can't laugh at darkness,
it is.
But it just, yeah. No, to the right. You are a funny man, Mr. Bond.
See, the thing is, you almost have to laugh at that scene, especially you know, us, you know, me as a, you know, as a man who can empathize with what poor Mr. Bond is going through. You're like, you like, if you couldn't laugh at that scene, then you probably would not be able to watch it, because it's just that like horrific. The fact that Lashif, you know, he's like, I never understood all these elaborate tortures. It's the simplest thing in the world to cause more pain than a man can possibly endure. And then, of course, there is not only the immediate agony, but the knowledge that if you do not yield soon, there will be little left to identify you as a man. Which I should note that this scene actually comes directly from the original 1950s novel, which, as Mother Roy notes, well, she appreciates that too. He's like, you've taken good care of your body. Such a waste.
Such a waste.
But yeah, as I mentioned, this novel, the novel was written in 1953, and this scene, even though I haven't read the novel, it's my understanding this scene is in that novel, and it's was incredibly, you know, dark for the time, and people were like, they can't do that in this movie, can they? Yes, they can. They do, and it makes things, you know, incredibly visceral, because ultimately, you know, one of the things that defines Bond is, you know, his, you know, kind of his masculinity and his sexual prowess, and this is Lashif directly, you know, threatening that by using a knotted rope to wail on Bond's genitals again and again and again, and
it's like, and it's all the more horrifying by the fact that he actually doesn't swing it that hard the first time, but you can see like how much it's got absolutely how much pain it's inflicting, and so like it's bracing you for when he's gonna really up the ante with it. It's like, oh god. Yeah, and we're all sort of feeling that one.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's like, and it's telling that like this is the place that Lashif has found himself, because he is essentially like, you know, all of his other schemes have, you know, collapsed at this point. You know, he set up this entire high stakes poker game because he thought that like this was his arena that no one could best him in, but now Bond did. So now he's delving into Bond's arena of like the dark, you know, spycraft and torture, and, you know, making a very effective play at it. But even still, he's not getting what he wants, because Bond does not break, in a testament to his, you know, spirit. And even when Lashif actually starts to, you know, play the more psychological angle, where he's talking about the fact that like, even after I kill you in this horrific fashion and kill your, you know, your girlfriend Vesper, your country that you're willing to sacrifice this all for, they would still welcome me with open arms, because they need what I know. And that's where we see Bond just kind of, you know, settle down in the idea and just focus on the big picture, which is what he's trying to do. And the moment he comes closest to breaking is when he's hearing Vesper scream in the other room, because again, this kind of goes to the idea that ultimately another concept that they play with in the novel is that human beings are easier to fight for than principles. And in this case, you know, the idea of England and these like respectable, you know, and protecting these innocent people, that's a very fine thing to die for in this moment. But it's made unclear even if Bond can stand to potentially hear Vesper and see Vesper die at this point, because he's so in love with her. but even at that point, he does not break. And so Washif is, forced to go to even more extreme measures.
Yeah. Yeah, no, let's jump back a bit, because I want to talk about what is the centerpiece of the film, which is the poker game.
Yeah.
Let's introduce some of our more tertiary characters. Someone who I really want to mention is the character of Mathis, played by Giancarlo Giannini, and like he's just one of the, like, going into this movie, like I know the actor has been in other things, and in his home country more so than America, but like he was one of the big surprises for me in this movie. I think he's just so good. I love the way he plays off of Daniel Craig and Eva Green. He's just got this twinkle in his eye, and and he's a lot of fun. He's the one who's kind of set things up for them, and he's helping them out, and with like the local authorities and stuff like that. And later in the film, he gets pointed as a traitor, which he is not, and it just makes him all the more endearing throughout the film. So I really enjoyed his character, like those little moments where he's like, I'd say your luck is improving, Mr. Bond.
No, I mean, he is in some respects kind of filling the void left by Q, given that Q is not in this movie, as kind of the Bond's like go-to man. But the bond between them is just, it feels very sincere, and it's one of the reasons, and it's partly because they've both been in this life and they understand it more than Vesper does. And so like Bond, even though he kind of has a little bit more of a prickly relationship with Vesper at first, he takes to Mathis like almost immediately, because he's like, this guy's clearly great at his job and understands what we need to do. And, he appreciates having that in this dangerous situation that he's in. And Mathis is also just so goddamn charming, when they're talking about, like, in that opening scene where he's like, are they watching us? He's like, I don't think so. Probably because there's no we. Just me. I'm afraid if you get into trouble here, the cavalry won't be coming over the next hill. But still, he bribes the police chief, as you said, and then he's the one who gets rid of the bodies later, and with the line like, being dead doesn't mean that one can't still be helpful.
and then of course this moment when Vesper walks in the dress, he's like, and I don't think I have to tell you how absolutely beautiful you look. And yeah, half the men at that table are still watching you.
No lies detected.
Yeah. No, he's just so much fun. And I was glad they brought him back for Quantum of Solace. Just wish he had been in more of it.
Yeah. No, I mean, and honestly, that is one of the reasons that this movie, he is so effective. Like, the fact that his bond with Bond is so strong in this movie is one of the reasons he's such an effective red herring. And when Bond starts to suspect him of being, the traitor who is aiding Washif, you're like, that tracks, because that's devastating in and of itself, that potential. Like, not Mathis, we like Mathis. Damn it. Yeah. And then especially, but like the fact that ultimately Mathis was not the traitor, and he does come back, and ultimately he forgives Bond, and they have another adventure in Quantum of Solace that does not end well for poor Mathis. But ultimately he is the character who is really essential in that movie to forcing Bond to reckon with the trauma that he goes through with Vesper, because he is the one who knows the connection between Bond and Vesper better than anyone else other than the two of them, because he saw it, forged. But yeah, so great character.
Yeah, and then we absolutely have to mention the great Jeffrey Wright. as
Yes.
Felix Leiter. I have like it was. I mean, obviously, I knew that Felix Leiter had been a character in other Bond films, but he's never felt as like vibrant of a character as in these films, and I was just so utterly delighted that he carried over into the other films in the series and played quite an important role. So and I just love Jeffrey Wright. He's one of my favorite actors. He's been in a bunch of other stuff like The Hunger Games, Westworld, The Batman, Boardwalk Empire. Like he's just an astonishing actor, and he has so much charisma in pretty much everything, but especially as Felix in this movie. I just love his exchanges with Bond. He's like, when they make the deal for him to stake, Bond in the game, and Bond's he's like, one condition, we get to bring him in, and we being the CIA, and Bond says, well, what about the winnings? And he goes, does it look like we need the money?
Yeah, no, their dynamic is instantly, just so fun and so charged, because I will just note that this was the first thing that I ever saw Jeffrey Wright in, so even though I like knew that about the character of Felix Leiter, and I might have even known that Jeffrey Wright was playing Felix Leiter, I was not ready for just how like awesome he was going to be, even in a relatively small amount of screen time that he has here, because they introduce him in a pretty unobtrusive fashion. He's just another one of the faces at the poker game, and he gets a couple of really good character building lines, like when Bond orders the Vesper for the first time, and everyone's like, that sounds good, I'll have one. And he's like, my friend, bring me one as well. Keep the fruit.
and then at one point when, Bond and Le Chiffre are going at each other, and Bond is making the play counting on Le Chiffre's bluff. And he says, someone knows something I don't.
and
he just has all these great little moments that like feel, like you said, unobtrusive enough, but then once he's revealed as Felix Leiter, CIA, all the pieces fall into place, and he's just made this like an endearing character without us even realizing it.
No, and that scene where because he really gets his moment to shine after Washif has fooled Bond by the fact that Bond thinks he's figured out Washif's tell, and he has, but then someone, it's revealed who later, has told Washif that actually if you do this you can trick Bond, and so Bond gets wiped out, and he is trying to get bought back into the game, and Vesper won't do it in this moment because she is worried that it's just his ego that is driving him in this moment, and she also just doesn't want to see him get hurt in that way.
And also also what we don't know at the time is that she's supposed to see to it that Bond doesn't actually win, so
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But in this moment, Bond is frustrated because he basically was like, I made a mistake, but I can beat him. I can beat him. And Eva and Vesper was basically she won't do it. So Bond almost snaps in that moment. This is where he has the famous martini shaken or stirred. Do I look like I give a damn? And then he doesn't even drink that martini because he picks up a knife and is just going to go stick it in Washif's neck. But this is where Felix Leiter very smoothly just catches his arm and is like, funny game, right? Sorry, I should have introduced myself, seeing as we're related. Felix Leiter, brother from Langley.
It's so good.
It's just an awesome introduction, but then even as he recognizes that Bond has and is set on doing this, he kind of just smoothly talks him out of it with the whole. And I love his line reading of listen, I'm bleeding chips. I'm not going to last much longer. You have a better chance. I'll stake you. And then we get the famous, as you said, does it look like we need the money line? But it becomes the foundation for a very sincere friendship between the two characters. Bond has a lot of like important relationships in his life. I don't know how many like true friends he has. Felix is undoubtedly one, and perhaps his best. Like, he shows up in most of the he shows up in Quantum of Solace. But by the time they're together in No Time to Die, and they're just like drinking and having a good time in Jamaica, you're just like, yeah, the bond between these two characters as like they perhaps understand better than anything else, like what it is to live this life, and that you can't have everything, but perhaps you could have something like this. And it's what makes his fate in No Time to Die, unfortunately, so goddamn tragic. But for this movie, it's just, his scene is a short one, but it's so effective because Jeffrey Wright just crushes it.
Yeah, no, he feels like he's in more of the movie than he is, because he just made such an impression. Yeah. And just talking about like the setting of all this stuff in the middle of the film, it's part of what I was so excited about with this movie, because the movie has its fair share of like big action sequences, but the center of the movie is focused around a poker game, and it does feel like James Bond at its sort of root, of that, of just, being a spy, sitting down at a card table, playing a game, trying to, outsmart, the terrorists sitting across from him. It's like, it's Bond at his most basic. Which I think was always so exciting for this movie. And I just love watching the twists and turns, of the game. And then, you've got Mathis basically playing narrator for the audience, describing what's going on with the game. And he's describing it to Vesper, of course. He's a very good exposition guy.
And I mean, the movie kind of needs that because ultimately it's hard. One of the reasons they haven't done something like this in a lot of other movies is it is kind of hard to make a card game cinematic in this way. But as you said, this is kind of the original James Bond flavor, because this is the central conceit of the first James Bond novel, Casino Royale, which incidentally, that game that they play in that 1950s novel is Baccarat. They updated it to Texas Hold'em poker because that was kind of all the rage at this time. But
I would like to say we do, and we get Baccarat in the other films, and notably in Goldeneye, when he, at the beginning of the film, when that's the game that he's playing with Xenia, and that's a beautiful scene. And yeah, so but they switched it to poker here. I understand why.
Yeah, no, and I mean it works really well. Although it's there are poker purists out there who sometimes get in a huff with these sequences, because it is fair. The hands that some of these players draw in this game are pretty ridiculous. Like in particular, the winning hand, the fact that all four of those guys have absolutely amazing hands, like one after the other, and culminating with Bond with his straight flush. It's like, yeah, the odds of that happening are probably in the several hundred thousands, if not millions. But you know what? They do actually have, even though they rely on the idea of bluffing throughout the movie, ultimately, in order to make that definitive statement, they need to have Bond actually definitively beat Lashif. And it feels like he has earned that at this point, just by the way the movie has set up this entire sequence and throughout this half-hour section.
Yeah, I don't know anything about poker, so I'm totally fine with it.
Yeah, I will not. Like, I'm not like a big poker player myself, but probably the time in my life I was most interested in poker was this time, because my friends in high school and I would play around, and it was around the time this movie came out. So I was all about the poker stakes that they play with in this movie, and like which hands can beat which hands. And the games that we played in high school, we did not have $150 million stakes, but it did feel exciting, and that's, I kind of felt that translate here.
And Yeah, and there's another exciting sequence in this movie where, right after Felix says he's going to stake Bond in the game, where Le Chiffre, poisons Bond. And it's just this great tense moment of Bond looking at the glass, looking at Le Chiffre, and there's this evil smile on Le Chiffre's face, and then it goes into this sequence where Bond races out to the car, hooks himself up to this defibrillator, and calls back to MI6, and they're talking him through how to what to inject himself with, and how to show him. I do want to take this opportunity. It's a shame I don't have a picture of him, but when he calls in, I think one of the people we actually see in the scene and who appears earlier in the film is a baby-faced Tobias Menzies as like M's like assistant, or junior assistant or whatever. And and he's not a big part, but he's got a couple good moments in the movie. And this was back, like, this was very shortly, I think this was the year after Rome, the first season of Rome. And so I was totally doing the DiCaprio meme when I saw him in this. Because these were early days for Tobias Menzies, and it was very exciting to see him in something. So
yeah, I had not seen Rome by the time I had seen this movie, so this was the first thing I'd seen him in. So he was just baby-faced actor there. I did the reverse Leonardo DiCaprio after, because I kind of forgotten about it when I got to Game of Thrones, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's Tobias Menzies. There's Ember Tully. Then I went back and watched those the episodes. I was like, oh. Even though that came later. But yeah, he's funny in his few brief scenes, especially in this like one where he and the doctor are trying to talk Bond through the fact he's been poisoned, and Bond is just kind of like, I'm all ears. And then of course
push the button, Bond.
and he's pushing it, but the freaking lead isn't hooked up, so he's going to pass out. And this is where Vesper actually saves his life, something that she does not have to do, because, as you said, if she's supposed to make sure he doesn't win, and if she was actually loyal to the people who were holding her strings, she would have let him die here, but she doesn't. She takes action and jerks him back to life. And the great moment when he looks up and he's basically like, thanks. And then the doctor thinks he's talking to him, and he's like, you're welcome. Now get him up to a hospital. And he's like, right, just as soon as I won this game.
But also, I really love the moment when he first wakes back up, he's like, you all right? And she's like, me,
yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great. Oh God.
Yeah.
But then when he sits back down at the table, and that last hand nearly killed me.
Which again is like, that's the kind of line that's like, yes, you're laying it on thick there, but like, you earned it in that moment.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah, it's so great. Yeah, I do want to. We can talk more about this section of the movie if you want to, but I just want to make sure we don't leave behind. I want to jump backwards to earlier in the film, because I don't want this whole sequence to sort of get left out. Is the scene in
Thomas?
What?
In the Bahamas and Miami.
Yeah, in the Bahamas, yeah. Which is so great, so much fun. Just like some highlights I just want to mention, just like when he arrives, and he gets mistaken for Valet. He proceeds to crash the guy's car who's being a jerk to him, while at the same time providing him with a way to go in and look at the security footage, which, by the way, most hilarious product placement in the entire world, because they've got the whole like security area has like rows Blu-ray recorders, and all the recordings are on Blu-ray discs. And like, that is hilarious to me for two reasons. One, because this is a Sony film, and of course they freaking put Blu-ray in there. But the idea that a Havana hotel security had their whole setup in 2006 on Blu-ray, and especially that they had Blu-ray players that worked that quickly and that efficiently, that is like more fantastical than anything else in this movie. Anybody who had a Blu-ray player in 2006 can tell you that they were just a headache to operate. But yeah, no, I just that stuck out to me, and I could not stop laughing. But yeah, no. Not related to the movie, but it was a lot of fun.
This movie has some tasteful product. Like product placement is very rarely tasteful, but this movie does it about as tastefully as you can do, including the whole like this conversation about the watches. Is like, is that Rolex? Omega. But as you said, yeah, it's unrealistic that they would have Blu-rays, but it's a swanky resort. Maybe they have a hookup somewhere. But I particular just like this sequence. This sequence is probably just good old-fashioned spycraft, and for that reason, it's probably the most fun section of the movie. Purely fun, just because Bond is really in his element here. He's in a beautiful location. He's getting to just kind of operate in this element. There are beautiful women every which way, giving him the just like hot damn once over, whether it's the two women playing tennis or the receptionist clerk, or most fatefully Solange, the wife of Demetrios, the slimy bugger who he is working as the middleman for Le Chiffre's plot to blow up the airline. And this is where we can praise Katarina Munro, who is playing Katarina Marino, I should say. She is playing the much more classic version of the Bond girl here.
Yeah.
She is, and talk about gorgeous. Obviously she is incredibly beautiful.
I wish I had a GIF of like the moment when she's walking out to the car, which was used in all the trailers.
Yeah.
Because hot damn.
Yeah.
You want to talk about a killer dress?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, but their dynamic is just more like instantly flirtatious, especially in the aftermath of Bond. He basically wipes out Demetrius at the poker table. Not only takes all of his money, takes his car. And the Aston Martin, the famous Aston Martin, and then he takes his wife. Which, we would almost feel bad for Demetrius if he wasn't such a scumbag.
Yeah, and he's like, you're just waiting for this guy to get killed by Bond. And it's very satisfying when he is. But yeah, no, that sequence where where she goes out to the car and then Bond's there and she's like, no wonder he was in such a foul mood. Then the beat with could go to my place. Your place? Is it close? Very. Jump in the car, then just drive around in a loop. And he's like, welcome to my place, or welcome to my home.
And she laughs at that because as she says, even though she professes to be loyal to her husband, she is, as she says, I'm afraid I'm not that cruel. Perhaps you're just out of practice. Which again is one of those just incredibly suave lines that you could not pull off in real life unless you were as charming as Mr. Bond is. But it also actually sets up an important dynamic for Bond, which is the fact that he obviously gets into all of these relationships over the course of his work, but he notes here that like he has a tendency to get into these relationships with married women, specifically because he thinks it keeps things simple if they can just keep it on a purely sexual level. And that is very much what is happening here. It's a very sexy scene, although ultimately Bond is he's just he has ulterior motives, obviously. And the kind of the brutal ending of it, where she's like, apparently he's on the last flight to Miami, so you have all night to question me. And you're like, all right, let's go. But then he calls up the champagne and he's like, can I have the champagne and the beluga caviar for 2, sir? No, for 1. And then the theme kicks in and he's off, and it's a great like little spycraft moment, but obviously knowing what happens to Solange later, it becomes much darker in retrospect.
Yeah. And really and again, kind of foreshadows what happens in Quantum of Solace as well. It's showing this trend of like Bond just, just being cold and put it intelligently, like using women and not, and keeping himself distant and not really allowing himself to care what happens to them, which is why the relationship with Vesper is so unique and challenges him. And then when he gets burned by that, he, goes, flies all the way to the other end of the spectrum in the following film with like not having any emotional attachment. And so it gets dark, but before that it's fun. And the whole sequence at the airport is just great fun. And then I bring in Tobias Menzies up again, because when he gets on the phone, it's like, she's not here. Can I take a message? He goes, you get her phone. You can tell her to call the security in Miami airport, because I think a bomb is about to go off. And then Tobias Menzies is like, yes, can you hold a moment?
You might.
Yeah.
And then when they get Emma back on the line, he's immediately like, I'll call you back.
That is one of the like great moments between them in this movie, because it's just so funny. And the whole pursuit, and there's the fight with what's his name?
Demetrios, basically the silent knife fight in. Which is great, because it's set in this cool location of the body display exhibit, but then also the two characters are like, they're trying very much to kill each other, but they're also trying not to draw attention to each other, so they're just doing this in complete silence. It's like wrestling over this knife, and then Bond like does the whole like, what's that behind you trick that Demetrius falls for. It's like, all for Demetrius, that like you deserve to die.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, putting aside how awful Demetrius is as a person, like, he deserves his fate just for falling for that.
It is almost the classic, like tap on the shoulder and you look the wrong way, and it's just like, come on, guy. Whereas, and then there's the whole thing now. It's on, the runway, and the great classic chases and the truck, and that ultimately ends with the guy blowing himself up, which is a lot of fun. The classic, like, I mean, it's a great fight sequence between Bond and this guy Carlos, played by Claudio Santamaria, but all the twists and turns, coming into play, where it seems like actually that Bond has not only like failed to stop this, but he might end up getting like blamed for it. And then the guy's just standing there smirking, and then he presses the button, and all of a sudden it's the beep beep, and then you just see his eyes go wide. It's like, oh my god, oh shit. We just hear the explosion. We see Bond's like little smirks, like, I got you.
Yeah, so this whole bit of the film is a lot of fun, and like, it's like classic Bond adventure, but also like on a big scene. So it gives you some of the thrills of like, there is a lot in this movie that gives you sort of the classic thrills of, the earlier era, but more grounded, so it doesn't get too out of hand. And but yeah, no, so I just wanted to make sure we didn't forget that section of the movie, because I think it's a lot of fun. Yeah, and so jumping before we start to get towards the sort of climax of the movie, was there anything else you wanted to say about like the poker scenes?
No, I mean, it was really just I found it very, effective that, like, if this was going to be like the big centerpiece of the movie, that one of the reasons it works is because they kind of take the philosophy that Bond himself talks about when he describes the game to Vesper, which is like, in poker, you never play your hand, you play the man sitting across from you. And what this sequence really does is it really gives us the most direct connections between Lashif and Bond, and like some of the most fascinating and tense moments are just the moments where they're sitting across from one another and staring at one another and giving little gestures or smiles or smirks or like anything they can try to do to trick the other into giving away their tell. And ultimately, it is Lashif who folds first. And if he didn't have that ace in the hole, Bond might have had him much earlier. But it really kind of just goes to show how capable Bond is, that, unlike Lashif, he is not a mathematical genius who can predict the probabilities of all these cards, having like a 17-1 chance of making your straight or whatever it was that Lashif said earlier. But he wins because he understands how to play the personal dynamics better than Lashif does. And so it's a triumph of Bond's kind of ingenuity and, ultimately emotional intelligence, as opposed to Lashif's more analytical intelligence and kind of cold-hearted nature. Yeah.
And so Bond ends up winning it in just a great moment when he delivers that. Yeah, the flush, just the reaction on Lashif's face is so great. And yeah, and so it's a moment of celebration, and Felix says that great moment of many thanks, brother. And yeah, it's great. And then we got those celebratory, little dinner between James and Vesper, which is just another really beautiful scene between them, where I think this is what you alluded to earlier, where they're trying to do that sort of familiar banter.
Yeah.
But there's no mistaking that there's such a more emotional, close connection between them at this point, which is why, when he remarks about the necklace and she says, I just thought it was something pretty, and he says, no, you didn't. And it's just, it cuts to the core, and it's a beautiful but sad scene when you know what's coming up. And and then she's got the bit where says, you can switch it off so easily, can't you? Doesn't bother you killing those people. Well, I wouldn't be very good at my job if it did. And says, I don't believe you. And just because you've done something doesn't mean you have to keep doing it. And I think that is really kind of, it's laying the foundation for the core of his character throughout the rest of these films.
Yeah, no, I mean, she truly has seen him at this point, and she understands him and she knows him, and he is reckoning with that fact and the fact that he now knows and sees her. But they have, like, because this is supposed to be ostensibly a triumphant moment, they find themselves in a wondering, like, well, if everything that happens with Lashif wasn't going to happen, like, well, what would become of this? Bond is just going to have to go off and do his next mission, and Vesper is going to go back to her job at the Treasury. And did everything that we go through in this moment, like, is anything going to come of it, or did we just have this incredible connection and now we're going to kind of pretend it never happened? And neither of them want that to be the case, even though they're not willing to admit it yet. It takes kind of the extraordinary circumstances that unfold subsequently to kind of catalyze the fact that they're like, no, we're actually, what we have is real and we're going to do something with this. But in doing so, they go through all measure of hell, which makes everything else just feel that much more tragic when the cost finally comes.
And this is where we get the finger pointed at Mathis, where it's set up to Little H, and Mathis has betrayed them to Lashif, and it's staged to make it look like Vesper's been taken, and Bond goes after her, and this is what leads us to the scene we talked about earlier with Lashif and Bond. It's all set up on this the setup where it's we think that Vesper is being held and tortured when really this has been this is part of their plan to get Bond to give up the password. It all comes kind of crashing down when another character who we actually haven't talked about yet, who's pretty damn important to the rest of these films, and Mr. White shows up and has decided that, okay, he's had enough of Lashif, and as he says, money isn't as important to us as knowing who we can trust. And
who could we be? Who? We'll find out.
Yeah, and I don't have a super great picture of Mr. White, but you can see him in the background here of this shot. And this Mr. White is going to be a very important character moving forward. He is, of course, the spoiler alert, the father of Madeline Swan, and he will make a number of appearances throughout the rest of these films, and which we had no conception of in this film. But I actually think in retrospect, again, whether any of this was thought out in advance or not, probably not, but it's really sort of elegant the way he's sort of peppered throughout this film, sort of setting up his character. And I just want to make sure we mention him, and he's played by Jesper Christensen, and I think that he did a great job throughout all of these films.
Yeah, and I think that he serves his role perfectly in this movie as just, kind of shadowy background face of this evil organization, the true power players of which we will meet later. And if that had been all his role had ever been in the franchise, it would have been perfectly great for this movie, but he becomes so much more important. In addition to, yes, as he's moved to kind of Bond's, in a weird way, future father. How their dynamic plays out in this movie. It's like, family dynamics are complicated there. And the other element of this, before we leave this sequence, that I just want to shout out is just at the beginning of it, at the chase sequence when Bond is chasing after the car that has taken Vesper, and he's driving along this dark winding road at night, and then all of a sudden he comes around a corner and Vesper is lying there in the middle of the road, and we just see Bond immediately turn the wheel so he doesn't hit her, and it causes his car to flip. That
was in the trailer for the movie. And by the way, this movie had such good trailers. It really did. And I just remember seeing that in the trailer and like, oh, holy shit. It's it's great. But Yeah, so what's happening off screen, when Mr. White comes in, that we don't actually see at this point, but what we'll find out later on is that Vesper actually makes a deal with Mr. White to spare Bond's life in exchange for the money. And we don't find that out quite yet, but that definitely plays a factor, because you'd be forgiven maybe on an initial watch for not quite knowing like what Vesper's motives are, because we don't have like a full picture of what's going on with her until the end of the film. And then you can think, well, how much was real, how much wasn't. But I think that we're sufficiently shown at so many points throughout this film how much she truly loved James, and how much she cared about him, and the fact that she makes this deal here to spare his life is the strongest example of that. And and so we think that we've reached, it feels like things have settled down, though it kind of feels like, not exactly, but kind of like an Alien ending, where it seems like we've sort of defeated the bad guy, but it feels like something's still about to happen. And Bond wakes up. He points the finger at Mathis, who gets taken off very unceremoniously. I feel really, really bad for him, knowing that he didn't do anything wrong. And then we get what starts to look like a happily ever after for James and Vesper, and their scenes together here are so beautiful. Just that moment when Vesper says, she's breaking down. She's like, James, I just want you to know, if all that was left of you was your smile and your little finger, you'd still be more of a man than any man I've ever known. And of course he adds, that's because you know what I can do with my little finger.
No idea, but you're aching to find it. No, their dynamic in this scene is just so wonderful. It's incredibly romantic, it's incredibly sexy, and it's incredibly emotionally intimate. Because this is the scene as where Bond ultimately owns up to the fact that Vesper has made her way into his heart, and the exchange where she is looking at him and she's like, "You're not going to let me in, are you? You've got your armor back on," and he has the beautiful, almost poetic line of, "I have no armor left. You've stripped it from me. Whatever is left of me, whatever I am, I'm yours." And of course, she falls into his arms at that moment, because, that is the way she feels as well. He has done that for her too. And so it's a great swoon-worthy kiss in a beautiful location on Lake Como, which I have to let you know that I did not know this the first time I watched the movie, but I was thinking, that place looks really, really familiar. And I went back, and indeed it is. This is Villa del Balbianello on Lake Como. And yes, it is the same location that Anakin and Padme shot their Lake Vista scenes.
Oh my God.
Which made me so happy.
I did not know that. And now I'm never going to be able to unknow it. Yeah, no.
Two for two.
And we get beautiful, sexy time with beautiful people.
Yep. No, hot people being hot together. Nothing wrong with this.
Yeah, but it's also wonderfully happy, which is why we know that, oh God, something's going to happen. This is going too good. And this is not like, the movie's not going to end like this, because Bond does not walk away from being 007, and he doesn't get his happily ever after. So
no, I mean, this entire sequence, like, I mean, I I was very glad that like the first time I was watching this movie in the theater, I didn't know that like what the exact runtime was. So like I was not like aware that like, oh, there's like a half hour left, some more stuff's happening. So I was like, I feel like there's more to the story, but it's also like, yeah, the movie can just end right here. It's okay. It's fine. In fact, I kind of want it to end right here. But in particular, like that beautiful line on the beach where Bond straight up tells Vesper, like, you know, that he's like, everyone, like she asked about how he knew it was Mathis, you know, basically trying to figure out like how, you know, why did you point the finger at him when it's actually her who's been the double agent? He has the great line like, well, remember the line about Mathis's, you know, Lashif's tell? Well, Mathis told Lashif, and she's like, does everyone have a tell? And he's like, yes, everyone except you. I wonder if that's why I love you. And just like, of course, like it's because she is kind of this enigma that he can't quite figure out. She is a mystery that he has cannot solve, but he wants to spend the rest of his life solving it. And he basically tells her that, yes, like I love you enough to quit and float around the world with you until one of us gets an honest job. Though I'm afraid that's going to have to be you, because I have no idea what an honest job is. And it's telling that, like, even though she knows that, like, this can't last because of the nature of the deal that she's made, the joy on her face seems very real. And I think in this moment, she almost allows herself to believe it. You know, it's like, maybe if I can pull off this deal, maybe they will let us alone. Maybe they will let us walk away, and then we can be happy. But of course, that is not the nature of the story.
Yeah. I also want to highlight one other character. I don't even know his name, but because he comes at this moment, the Swiss banker,
Herr Mendel, yeah.
Herr Mendel.
Just guy who loves his job.
Purely for Bond's line of, you didn't bring any chocolates. And he goes, no, I'm afraid not. The fact that he giggles at that, and then Bond just slips like,
he's a little weird, yeah. But he likes his job.
Yeah. So, and of course, you know, this is sort of it pays off that the password is Vesper, and which leads into all the stuff we were just talking about, but it's also like setting up the big reveal to come. But first we get, more happy stuff of Bond and Vesper going off and riding in boats and sleeping in hotels. And it's like, okay, the happy stuff is carrying on for way too long. Something's about to happen. And it's that Vesper is about to go to the bank to withdraw the money to deliver to Mr. White's men, but she leaves the phone behind because as M will later say, she knew you were you, and so she knows that James will look at it and then follow her. And I think what M, another thing she says is also true. I think she, even though she might hope that she might live, she's also probably certain that she's marching towards her death, and I think she's ready for that. I think she's kind of accepted that, and so what we get is, it's a great action climax, but it's also very sad and very tragic, and it's big, and we get a building like flooding and collapsing, and it's big in all the great Bond traditions. But I do want to note, while we're talking about the emotional context of everything, what's so great about this sequence, and I noticed it when I was watching is, and to be clear, I'm sure that this movie has, numerous visual effects that we're not even aware of and seeing, but it's so much of it is grounded in in camera stuff, and there's nothing in this action climax that smacks of CGI overkill. Even though, like I said, I'm sure there is some CGI masking some stuff that we're not supposed to see, and and all that stuff. But it's not heavy-handed. It's not overused, because this was still 2006, and sequences like this were being handled in mostly old school fashion still. And I love that. It just feels, everything feels so tactile, so that you can focus on the drama and the emotions of the characters. And I think it's one of the things that makes this film overall, I feel like this is one of the Bond movies that I feel is going to be the most timeless, because we talked about the fact that Martin Campbell also directed Goldeneye, but Goldeneye is a very distinctly 90s movie. I love it to death, but it is rooted in the time in which it was made. And who knows, maybe as the years go on, there'll be more signs of this movie being from the time in which it was made, but it's almost 20 years on, and it still feels pretty timeless to me. And I think that that's as much to do with the aesthetics of the production as anything in the actual like tone of the filmmaking. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure to point that out, because I think that the production on this movie kicked ass.
Yeah. No, I think that the production design, the cinematography, the costumes, and the way this film is edited all come together to give it just an immaculately crafted sense of, like, it feels like everything in this that you see happening in the frame of the camera is something that could actually plausibly be happening. And it's never more true than in this incredibly visceral sequence, because obviously it's an incredibly dangerous setup. The fact that it's taking place in this Venetian building that's being held up by these buoys, and as these buoys start to collapse because people are shooting guns everywhere, the building itself is collapsing and literally like tilting on its axis, and it kind of mirrors, as you said, like, again, the function of the production mirroring the character's emotional state, because their worlds are being upended. One of my absolute favorite little moments in the line readings and moments of performance from Daniel Craig is the moment when he's tailing Vesper into the meeting with the mysterious guy with the half of a dark glasses, classic evil, villain attire. And she hands off the money, and and then the guy realizes that Bond has followed them, and he immediately grabs Vesper and pulls her close and puts the gun to her head and screams out, "I'll kill her." And we just see Bond kind of lean back against the pillar, close his eyes, pull his gun, and say softly, "Allow me." And you're just like, fuck. That, because that is not what he wants to do, but in many respects he feels that it is his duty, that now that he knows that Vesper has,
but also he feels betrayed,
he feels betrayed, and that makes it all the more telling and savage and heartbreaking that when the moment comes, he actually can't do it. He can't watch her die. And then the fact that,
well, before we get into I just want to backtrack to just a couple minutes to when Bond gets the phone call from M. It's like, "I have a lovely man from the Treasury here wondering if you're ever going to deposit the winnings." And just watching the switch go off in his head, and he goes, "That's a shame. I didn't think they'd miss it." Well, I told them not to worry. Which is great, but yeah, that's the moment where his whole world gets turned upside down, and it's again, this whole ending is so tragic. I mean, as wonderful as all the action stuff is, and it's great, it really is a very good action climax, but it's the core of it is when then he gets to the is it an elevator, or
it's an elevator? It's a cage elevator that
and just when he and Vesper lock eyes, And the way she just says, "I'm sorry, James." It's just so heartbreaking.
No, and the fact that, like, she's made it clear at this moment that, as devastating as this choice is, she has made the decision she does not want to be saved. Whether it's that she can't face the fact that she couldn't live with knowing that she had betrayed James, or if she just was scared that something worse would happen with Spectre coming after him later. She is trying to end it in this way that is going to be horrific for her, but it's going to be equally horrific for him, because he has basically been like an almost descended into animalistic feral rage in this sequence, and it's incredibly, like visceral in the sense that, like, he's getting shot with nail guns and he pulls the nails out of his shoulder and he uses the nail gun to shoot the guy in the eye, and like you can tell that he just does not care in this moment.
And then in the eye patch eye, which is like really funny in a morbid way in this, but it's like darkly funny, because you're not going ha ha at this point in the movie. No. But yeah, and I've often wondered about why exactly Vesper makes the choices she makes, and I think that it's up in the air for you. You could wonder if she's doing it in a way to kind of try and protect James, because they're not going to stop coming after her. Is it a knowledge that her fate is not going to be good no matter what happens? Either she's going to be killed by Quantum or Spectre, whoever, or she's going to, face her fate as a traitor, to the British government, and like that's not a fate. That's not going to be a good fate. So yeah, there's sort of multiple things going on there that culminate with her making that decision, and but she doesn't want James to share that fate, which is why it's just so emotional and heartbreaking watching her try to sort of stop him from trying to save her, and the fact that and she dies in that moment, not knowing what his fate is going to be. It's just so it's so heartbreaking and emotional.
Yeah, no, this entire sequence has honestly not left my mind since I saw it for the first time, because it is so emotional, but it's also just so horrific. The fact that when, she's locked herself in the cage that is now plunged into the water, and he, in his again, feral and desperate state, is basically trying to tear these metal bars apart so that he can get to her, and he almost does it, and to the point until she takes his hands in hers under the water and just kind of rubs them up against their face and almost calms him into a state of shock in that moment. And then she pushes off and deliberately screams to let the rest of her air out. And then he just starts even more desperately shaking the bar, and we see her reaching out to him no, no. And then she drowns. And it's she looks almost like a ghost or an angel in that sequence. And he is just he's watching the woman he loves die in this horrific fashion before a fate that she chose for herself, but that doesn't make it any less horrific. Drowning being such a terrible way to die, and the fact that he does manage to get the cage open and get to her, but it's too late.
It's too late.
And just his Daniel Craig's performance in the scene where he has Vesper up on the dock and he is just desperately trying to pump life back into her, kissing her, doing the CPR, trying to breathe the air back in, and she's just gone. And then when he finally accepts that, and he just collapses, and his eyes are wide, and he's shaking, and the music is swelling, and then he just takes her body in his arms, and I just found this haunting. It was
and back to circle back around to what we talked about at the beginning of the stream is this film is is really challenging our notion of Bond as a character, and historically this character who is very suave and brushes things off and isn't fazed by things, but then we end the movie with this character who is just shaken to his core and in this intense state of grief and horror and trauma. It's just like, it's so horrible, but also fascinating to watch.
Yeah, and it's something that the James Bond franchise had never quite done before, because we had seen, unfortunately, women in Bond girls in the previous Bond movies die in horrific fashion. The famous, Goldfinger scene, the gold plated Quantum of Solace calls back to. And probably the closest analogy to it, the end of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is the George Lazenby film with Diana Rigg as Countess Tracy Di Vincenzo, where Bond, marries her in the end, and then she gets gunned down by Blofeld, and the movie literally ends with Bond cradling her dead body and saying, "We have all the time in the world." This movie basically puts those two together, gives us a horrific death scene for Vesper, but that we feel like the emotional weight of it because we've come to love Vesper as a character and love them together. And Bond's just utter devastation in that moment. It doesn't give him the easy out of having the moment, the screen cut to black here. He has to sit with it. He has to live with it. We have to live with it. And that just makes
and the entire following movie is dealing with the fallout of it. And which is why I always feel inclined to defend Quantum of Solace, even if it's not it's not a perfect movie. It has its issues, but I think what it's doing is really important to the character. And also it's got a lot of great moments in the film. So but I think part of the audience might have been struggling with the fact that we're seeing that with this character, of him actually struggling emotionally with this loss.
I've come to appreciate Quantum of Solace much more on rewatches, because I think what I struggled with on its original watches was the fact that some of its filmmaking feels a little bit more choppy because it was made during the writer's strike. But the emotional core of the movie, I have just found more and more powerful on every rewatch, and that it's a lot of because of it's directly paying off what we got in this movie, and it's not.
And to be fair, it's sort of intentionally not as fun or as stylish as Casino Royale. They're two very different movies, but yeah, the writer's strike did not help. That was a major thing with that film. But yeah, so but just talking about this movie, it's it ends, we have that conversation with M, and James on the phone, and sort of talking about what actually happened with Vesper, and the fact that we come to find out she had a boyfriend. We're going to find out a lot more about that in the next film.
Not a great guy.
Yeah, it just makes it all the more tragic. But her trying to it's so again, their relationship is so interesting and so complex, because on the one hand she's saying, when he says no, keep sweating out Mathis, just because we can prove that she's guilty, not that he's innocent. And so on the one hand, M says, "You don't trust anybody, do you, Bond?" And he says, "No." And she says, "Well, then you've learned your lesson." But by the same token, she's also trying to appeal to his emotions and make him understand that, Vesper made a deal for his life, and so that he doesn't close himself off completely. She's trying to basically to avoid what happens in Quantum of Solace. And so it's a great note to end on with her character, because there's such dichotomy into there's what she's supposed to need from this man in her organization versus what she wants for him as basically a son.
Yeah.
And it's a really beautiful relationship. And then we get the tag of Bond scene that Vesper sent him a message, with Mr. White's phone number, which sets up that great final moment, which is just classic. It's just one of the most classic moments in any of these films, just watching Mr. White, pull up to his estate and answer the phone. It's like, hello, Mr. White? Yes. And we need to talk. Who is this? And falls to the ground having been shot, and we hear those opening bars. Dun, 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 the Bond theme. And then we see Bond's footsteps down the stairs. And Mr. White just looks up at him like this, and he goes, "The name's Bond, James Bond." And then the theme comes in fully, cut to credits, and that's the end of the film. It is such a satisfying ending to this film, and so amazing. And like that would have, we talked about what happens with Mr. White in future films. This would have been a totally satisfactory ending if this turned out to just be a standalone story, and that it showed that Bond gets the guy behind all of it, and it's like and that's why, like, I'm sort of fine with the fact that people have a wide range of opinions of Quantum of Solace and some of the other films, because even though yes, it does tie into this movie in the sense of it being an ongoing story, but this film worked so beautifully well as its own self-contained entity as well. That I just think that that nothing really can dilute Casino Royale as a just amazing work of art. And in my opinion, the later films greatly enhance it.
Yeah.
But even if you say, oh, I didn't care for some of the other ones, then you can still look at Casino Royale and be like, this is one of the greatest Bond films ever made, if not the best. And yeah, it's just incredible.
Yeah, no, I love this ending because it's the ending that this movie needed, as it's just its own story, even separate from the fact it's can go on to set up, the 5-film Daniel Craig saga that we get. Because I will note that the original novel that this movie is based, which again I have not read, but I've read enough about it and heard people talk about. The novel actually literally ends with the line that is spoken word for word in this movie, which is James telling M, what does it matter? It's done, and the bitch is dead. That's the final line of the book. And what the thing is, like, maybe that was the right ending for the book. It was absolutely not the right ending for the movie, because that was not the relationship that Vesper and James had. We know he does not believe those words in that moment. M knows he does not believe those words in that moment.
And to be fair, like that's actually, like, we can point out all the reasons why that's probably not the greatest line to end on in a modern context. But like, that's actually would be a really fitting ending if you're just like a final line from the movie, if you're just setting up the Bond that we have historically known, because actually that is so his character. He is someone who has gone through all this and looks at what just happened through that lens and cuts himself off emotionally, never gets involved with anybody, and that's it. But that is not the Bond that we're going to follow for the rest of these films. And so that's why that would have not been the right ending there. You need that additional exchange between Bond and M and this ending, which feels, which feels redemptive, and it feels it's Vesper getting, her victory against, against this, man who basically ruined her life. And it's James honoring that. And so, yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. And then it's like, the thing is, like, again, it may have been the right ending for the book and for the character, to go on and become a little bit more cold and emotionally distant. But because that was not the era that this movie is being told in and the story that it was telling, if they weren't going to do that additional material, I would have preferred they just cut the line entirely, iconic as it is. But I think it still works in this movie, harsh as it is, because it is the kind of thing that a man who's just had his heart broken into 10 million pieces by losing the love of his life in this horrific way might say and not believe. The fact that we, as you said, Vesper ultimately gets her victory because, she chose, strange as it is to say, like, she chose the terms of her own death. Quantum/Spectre does not get to dictate it to her. James gets to live. She gets to pass on this information to him. And ultimately, over the course of this saga, even though he's not quite ready to forgive her yet, he comes to understand that she truly did love him, and that she wanted the best for him. And the fact is that, like, as Em said, then you've learned your lesson. Like, he's learned many over the course of this story. But now, because he has gone through this trial by fire, we feel we have earned the right to end the movie on a much more hopeful and uplifting note with the most iconic line of them all. So,
yeah. And I do love there's a little behind the scenes bit where Daniel Craig talks about actually trying, like, he rehearsed the line and all that stuff, and he's like, it's this iconic line, and you think, yeah, I can handle this. And then he got on set and he said, and he's pretty sure one of the tapes was, the name's Bond, James Bond. Because he was just so nervous about it, because it is the line. But yeah, it's one of the most, like, iconic deliveries of it. And just, again, like, we talked about David Arnold, his musical score earlier, just the fact that this is the only moment of the film to feature, the quote unquote James Bond theme. It's just so amazing, and the composition of it is so amazing that they brought it back for the end of Skyfall. Because, like, I have some thoughts on Thomas Newman's score for that film. It has its moments, but it's not one of my favorite Bond scores. But they needed the David Arnold treatment of the theme for the end of that film. It's because in the last 30 years of, like, Bond films, nobody has done Bond music like David Arnold. He is the GOAT. So yeah, and this treatment of the main theme for the end of this film is just absolutely amazing and incredible.
I love this score. I love everything about this movie. And I feel like it had that special alchemy that, again, feels like it earned the right to end in this way and deliver, like, on the promise of, the theme, and getting us feel like truly James Bond is back. And he was, for 15 years after this, Daniel Craig was James Bond. And
yeah, it's so wild. I was thinking about this yesterday, and it's like, even though, okay, so his run was only 5 films, which is one more than Pierce Brosnan. It's not as many as Sean Connery and Roger Moore. It's definitely more than Timothy Dalton, and also George Lazenby. But it feels really significant in terms of how much time has passed, because this movie came out in 2006. It's, and No Time to Die came out in 2021, and they're still we still don't know who the successor is. It's 2025, so technically we're still in the Daniel Craig era until they announce, the new Bond, and so it feels like really momentous, and like this is a big event, because it's sort of shocking to think that the Bond that I was introduced to, Pierce Brosnan, his turn only went from 1995 to 2002. They squeezed in 4 films in that time, but he wasn't Bond for nearly as long, and it just feels like Daniel Craig's tenure as Bond has been quite a long time and very weighty, and he's really defined Bond for a generation. And especially the fact that, now we're entering into this new and different phase of Bond that is, whatever it is, it's going to be different. And in a lot of ways, Daniel Craig was farewell to Bond as he was, and yet he was something totally new as well. So it's this very weird thing to think that, whatever comes next will not be, it won't be in the hands of the Broccoli family. It's going to be something different. And in that way, I'm kind of glad that Daniel Craig was the one to, sort of bid farewell to that era of Bond. I don't know whether he's like my personal favorite, but I think like you cannot question the fact that he's a very strong contender for the best. I mean, it's just, you just look at what he brought to it, and I always say that, I think it's sort of inevitable that the Bond you're first introduced to tends to, have your bias as your personal favorite, which is why I'm always going to have a soft spot for Pierce. But Daniel Craig just, there was a lot going against him, and he rose to the occasion, proved all the naysayers wrong, and made a James Bond for the ages. So, big round of applause for him, and for this movie, which set off, a new James Bond that was like unlike anything we'd ever seen before.
Yeah, and I think that is why I feel pretty strongly confident in saying that Daniel Craig is my favorite James Bond. I will give the tip of the cap and all due respect to Sean Connery, the original, as perhaps the best Bond, because he really did kind of set the template for everything that came before. But I can definitely say that I personally love this run of Daniel Craig's, this era of Daniel Craig's, as like just an era of film, more than, even the classic, Sean Connery films, because there are some iconic ones in there. But, as you said, like, it's when you come to it, I came to the Sean Connery films later, when after Daniel Craig, inspired, me to go back and watch, Dr. No and From Russia with Love and Goldfinger, but Daniel Craig was kind of, the entry point to, my relationship with this franchise. Obviously, I'd seen Bond movies before, but as I said, this is the one I really first fell in love with. And I went back and looked, and it is notable that, like, in terms of just chronological years, Daniel Craig's tenure as Bond actually is the longest of any of the actors who played them. Roger Moore's was 12 years, even though he made the most films of any of them. And Sean Connery was 9 years, and there was even an interruption in there with the George Lazenby one. And obviously Timothy Dalton's and Pierce Brosnan's runs were shorter as well. Daniel Craig, and part of that is like, again, because of different production regions, they ultimately only made the 5 movies. But now that we have all 5, it really feels like such a complete set. And in particular, I know that there was a lot of speculation and angst that Craig didn't want to come back after Spectre. And if we had ended on Spectre, I mean, I've come to actually really appreciate that film in retrospect, and particularly the character of Madeline Swan. But in particular, I'm so glad that we got the final film, No Time to Die, because I think I've mentioned I was in tears at the end of that movie. And for so many reasons. And I think that because the emotions that were grounded in this movie paid off so brilliantly in that one. Among other things from the entire run, you mentioned the scene where he goes to Vesper's grave and he just says very quietly, "I miss you." And like all those moments throughout this movie, that movie and this one, and throughout the entire, run, I just think that it's as a 5, that's why I kind of feel like the Craig era, even though it's part of everything that came before and was in many ways a new era for Bond, after the Pierce Brosnan era, in many respects, I also feel it kind of like stands apart as its own. Like if you just wanted to watch the Craig Bond movies, you could do it, and get a complete story of this character.
Yeah, it's so weird. I'm like, because before Daniel Craig, the default answer was always like, even though I have like my personal, sort of affection is for Pierce Brosnan, it was kind of like, but Sean Connery is the default. He will always be the Drace, but the Daniel Craig era was something so different, and he did so many different things with the characters that it's kind of hard to make in my mind, to sort of compare, because nobody else had done what Daniel Craig had, ended up doing. And so, but I don't know. It just feels like it belongs to a different era. It's like, because you got, like, I always love in Goldfinger, the opening, Sean Connery going, "Shocking, positively shocking." And it's like, that's the kind of stuff that you're not going to get in a Daniel Craig Bond movie. And so for that reason, and also the fact that, I pretty much binged all the Bond movies after I saw Goldeneye back in '95. So yeah, all of that feels like very much of a time for me, and the Daniel Craig movies feel like something different. And I've said in the past, actually, as much as I love the Daniel Craig films and I really respect where they went dramatically with them, but there's also a very big part of me that actually really adores the fun, goofy, campy side of James Bond. And so I would kind of like to see a return to that at some point.
I wouldn't mind it either.
Yeah, and because that's the Bond I grew up on, and so yeah, like, and even like even stuff like in Tomorrow Never Dies, when when Bond walks up to Paris, played by the lovely Terry Hatcher, and she turns around, slaps him in the face, and everybody watching goes, "Whoo!" And he goes, "Was it something I said? How about the words, 'I'll be right back'?" Therethere's just something so wonderfully like silly and campy about, the Bond characters and stories and all that stuff that I still love deeply. So for me, it feels inevitable that the Daniel Craig movies, like, they exist almost in a separate category that's still connected, but it's just, they're so different. But it's also why, like I said, I think Casino Royale is my favorite of the Craig films, just by virtue of the fact that it's still a really fun movie. Yeah. Even as it's dealing with all the sort of more down-to-earth stuff and the drama and all that stuff, it's still like perfectly willing to have a really fun time. And I feel like as the films went on, they did get progressively sort of darker and more dramatic, which is great. and I enjoyed all the films. And by the way, I will say, like, my big great secret, and I'm gonna make it not a secret here, is that I love Spectre. I loved it in 2015, and as a character once said, "Ask me again in 10 years." It's been 10 years, and I still love it. And a lot of that had to do with the character of Madeline Swan. I loved her and thought that she was a great foil and you know, and character to bounce off of James. I love their connection and their love story, which I feel like it was, you know, and it's because that's who James lets in, you know, after Vesper. You know, it takes a while for him to get there, but he does, and that's what made No Time to Die so fucking heartbreaking, just watching where that goes. But also healing in a way, because it doesn't move away from that connection. It's just, it has a tragic ending, but it's completely enveloped in their love story. And yeah, so and I fucking love, give me Christoph Waltz as a villain anytime. And not to mention Dave Bautista, he was, you know, that was before he was really getting his dramatic stuff, but he had a great presence in that. So yeah, no, I count myself a big fan of Spectre. I think, I think it got a lot of flack because it leaned really heavily into sort of the gadgets and big explosions, and the Craig movies were supposed to be kind of a move away from that. But I'm like, no, you needed one of those movies to do that stuff, and it was still a very serious, dramatic film. And so, yeah, and like. And like for No Time to Die, like that movie, it's not like that movie like backs away from any of the stuff in Spectre. It completely embraces everything that was in Spectre and pays all that off. So yeah, I'm fine if people want to shake their head at me for that opinion, but I love it.
You won't get any shaking in the head from me, because I actually like it. It's one of the movies I was like most glad to revisit, because I did. You know, when I watched it in 2015, I think I was kind of affected by some of the discourse around it. But then when I was going back and watching all the films before No Time to Die, I was like, why did what was my problem? Like, this is fucking great. I really am enjoying all this. And I think part of it is that the fact that movie is, you know, we used the term campy earlier, but I will borrow a term from our friends at Force Center, especially Joseph Scrimshaw, who I know has a deep love for the James Bond franchise, and say that it's very pulpy. Because it is, you know, and all these movies are like, they lean into the larger than life characters and the, you know, the wild situations and the big cliffhangers and the romance of it all. You know, like, that is classic pulp storytelling. And while I have tended to celebrate it more in, say, Star Wars and the wild, wacky, like, humor and aliens and stuff, like, this is all pulp too. And like, and it's more grounded, but it's also incredibly, you know, compelling storytelling. So like, the fact is that I think that all of these movies are not afraid to be what they are. You know, like they are not, they are, yes, more down to earth, but I do not see them as being ashamed to be James Bond movies.
And again, I'm just gonna say again, like, fucking Lea Seydoux, you know?
Oh yes.
Like, just, she's absolutely amazing. And I'm sorry, but how can you say something bad about a Bond movie with her in it? Because she was just so fantastic. So yeah, sorry. I'm gonna hold up that flag proudly. But yeah, so, and then, you know what, this actually makes me feel like we should, like, not immediately because we have a lot of stuff planned, but we should go ahead and be resolved to discuss the rest of the Daniel Craig films, because
I'm down for it.
Because I feel like there's a lot that we could discuss, and that would be a lot of fun. Yeah, especially now that I know your feelings, sort of on Quantum of Solace and Spectre, which are always kind of the big question marks for when you're talking about the the Daniel Craig films. But I feel like we're enough on a similar wavelength with those movies that I think we'd have good discussions on all of these films. So yeah, we'll pencil that in for the future.
Nice. Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. But yeah, so we did it, and we're at 3.5 hours. I feel like we're winding ourselves back down to reasonable lengths.
Yeah, next week we may break the streak, because we may go long on Andor. But it is 12 episodes.
And an entire season of television, yeah. But that's okay. We allow ourselves that for certain things. Like, it's perfectly acceptable when it's Star Wars, Keira Knightley, or Christopher Nolan.
Yeah.
It's just when it's other stuff, we've been letting ourselves get out of hand.
And Lord of the Rings too. That's the other.
Oh yeah, Lord of the Rings. Yeah. But yeah, so it's thanks, Jared. This was a lot of fun. I was really looking forward to this one, because I love this movie so much, and it was just great to talk about James Bond, because we did the stream on Goldeneye, but that was also sharing. That was also my birthday stream, so it wasn't like we talked about the movie and we had a fun time doing it, but we didn't as fully immerse ourselves into it, I feel, as like we got to do with this one. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I loved doing it with you.
Yeah, I did too. And I was I can't wait now to talk about all the rest of the Craig Bond movies, because I think, even though I do consider this one to be the best, I think all the others have incredible, emotionally rich stories as well. And yeah, it's like, let's keep the good vibe going with this.
Yep. So just as a reminder for what's coming up, I'll just breeze through these next week. As we said, we're talking Andor Season 1. Then we'll be off for 2 weeks. On April 13th, we'll be back with an as of yet undecided topic, but it's going to be something more abstract, talking about, the film or cinema or something. We'll decide on a topic. We're actually going to talk about it right after we sign off. And then the week after that, on April 20th, we're going to be talking about the Star Wars The Clone Wars finale, The Siege of Mandalore, and also musing about the announcements coming out of Star Wars Celebration. Then we'll be off on the 27th, and then in May, we'll be discussing Andor Season 2, Kingdom of Heaven, the director's cut, and the original Star Wars. So yeah, I hope you guys will come back and join us for all that, and then what lays beyond. I will mention that I was half tempted, like I almost threw all our plans out the window, because that Pride and Prejudice 20th anniversary screening is coming up, and I was like, and it comes out on the 20th, and the 20th is our streaming date, although they are doing some early screenings here, so I'm actually going on the 18th. But I was like, oh God, what do we do? But I held firm. We're still going to do it in November, which I think there's every reason to believe that they're going to be releasing a 4K Blu-ray of Pride and Prejudice remastered before the year is out, because this screening is from a remastered 4K print or master, whatever you want to call it. So that tells me that they're preparing for a new home video release of the movie, which, hey, finally. Yeah. So maybe y'all get. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and that money is already spent for both you and
me. So yeah, I'll get to. I'd like to be able to enjoy that and show that off when we do the stream in November, celebrating the actual 20th anniversary. But yeah, so that's it. You got anything you wanted to mention before we go?
No, I'll just say one thing. We talked. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Stephanie.
We talked a lot about our friends at Force Center over the time, particularly when we talk about Star Wars. And I will just note that if any of you happen to be subscribed to the Force Center Patreon, Ken and Joseph, when they were doing their other center, era, actually had a phenomenal conversation about the first two Bond films. They did a discussion on Casino Royale and a discussion of Quantum of Solace. So far, they haven't gotten to the others yet. But if you enjoyed this discussion and you enjoy Force Center and you happen to be subscribed to their Patreon, I can't recommend their discussion of Quantum of Solace highly enough, because Joseph in particular is
he's a huge Bond fan.
Is a Bond scholar in many respects, and I tip my cap to his knowledge of this franchise and to Star Wars as well. Yeah,
and honestly, just subscribe to Force Center, period, because that's an amazing podcast and YouTube channel. And honestly, when it comes to Star Wars stuff, I rip off their observations enough that we really should be promoting them on a regular basis. So yeah, but lots of love to our friends over there, and just thank you for everybody who tuned in either live or after the fact. If this was your first time watching and you actually stuck all the way to the end and you haven't subscribed to our channel, please do so, and listen to our ramblings about many other films and TV shows. Again, thank you to everybody who was here live. Stephanie Frederick, Mother Royan. We had Laura popped in, earlier. Thank you very much for that. We love you guys, and we really just appreciate so much when you guys tune in. It really means a lot.
Absolutely. Well said.
Okay. Well, I guess that'll be that. And until next week, and we'll be talking about Andor. Until then, the name's Bond, James Bond. Not really, but just go with it.